Chapter 31, Life After Death.
Matt made it home, then?
Sirius asked, as Remus flew into the kitchen midway through dinner. Creature handed him a loaded plate, which Remus took gratefully and sat down in the seat opposite Harry, who was listening intently.
No problems,
Remus said, accepting a drink from Creature.
Debbie's spending the night there just in case, but no one's seen or heard anything of Graybacks since the attack.
That had been a week ago. Sirius had been up early, something he hadn't done regularly since before Azkaban, when Remus stumbled out of the fireplace and startled Sirius into spilling his tea. Remus had launched into a long, complicated and only semi-coherent explanation of the previous night's events. They hadn't seen much of him since, because he had been with the search during the days, and at Matt's bedside in St. Mungo's until late at night.
Well, where Greyback's concerned, no news is good news,
Sirius said. He gestured to Creature to bring him a second helping, which Harry had already started on.
I certainly hope so,
Remus agreed.
Is Debbie still mad?
Furious, Remus said, with a slight smile.
He had the nerve to invite himself into my own home and try to tell me what to do, and then he goes and nearly kills Matthew.
He said in a poor imitation of a woman's shrill, angry voice.
Honestly, I thought he wanted to convince me to join him, not turn me against him. You're terrible at voices,
Sirius said, smirking. Remus poked his tongue out, causing Creature to tut. Remus gave him an apologetic look and Sirius' smirk widened. Dinner was a quiet affair. Harry and Sirius had finally given in and spent the past few days rearranging the library, so there wasn't much to talk about. Sirius had even, after being caught up in one of his fussy moods, conjured little labels for the shelves. After the intensive research required to help him cast his mental Patronus, and the days spent stacking, sorting, and reshelving books, Sirius would be quite happy to not touch another book for quite some time. Harry's lessons, therefore, consisted of brewing and spell work, which Sirius thought suited him just fine. Harry did a lot better with practical work than he did with theory. They had dueled a little bit today, using only the spells he had been taught so far. Harry had lost spectacularly, but his reflexes were impressive and so was his ability to think on his feet. He'd be good with practice, Sirius was sure of it. By the time Creature brought out pudding, chocolate mousse, which Sirius declined, they had told Remus all of this, and he, in turn, had filled them in on the happenings in the search. There was very little to report, Sirius was pleased to note.
I've managed to get tomorrow afternoon off,
Remus said.
Are we still going, then?
Harry asked, pausing with his spoon halfway to his mouth.
Do you still want to?
Sirius asked. Harry nodded emphatically and Sirius grinned and reached over to ruffle his hair.
Then we'll go.
Harry smiled.
He's in serious danger of being spoiled rotten,
Remus commented, much later that night, when Harry had gone to bed.
In serious danger, is he, Moony?
Sirius asked slyly and then shook his head.
Nah, he's not.
Sirius' eyes narrowed and he felt a surge of loathing.
His aunt and uncle saw to that. I couldn't spoil Harry if I tried. And you are trying,
Remus said, grinning.
Am not. We don't get out enough for me to buy him much, and when we do, he insists on paying with his own pocket money.
Sirius shook his head.
We went out for ice cream the other day and he paid for my cone.
Remus chuckled.
Trust me, it's not actually possible to spoil him. I didn't say spoiling him was a bad thing,
Remus said.
You made it sound that way,
Sirius told him. Remus grinned.
Speaking of spoiling. What?
Remus asked in a tone that Sirius knew came from years of experience of dealing with Sirius when he had an idea.
Can we have Christmas at your house? At my...
Remus looked stunned.
Why? Neither of us can cook without magic, and it wouldn't be fair to ask Harry to do it again.
He had to cook most of their meals while he and Sirius were staying there after the incident with Marlene in September.
We can eat here,
Sirius said immediately.
Creature wants to do the cooking anyway, I think, but maybe we could spend the afternoon at your place. Why?
Remus asked.
What do I have that you don't have here? This place is huge. Is that a no?
Sirius asked.
No,
Remus grumbled.
I just don't understand. So it's a yes. Yes,
Remus sighed.
Brilliant,
Sirius said happily.
Are you going to explain now?
Remus asked, when he didn't say anything more on the matter.
Nope,
Sirius said, grinning.
I'm being mysterious. You're being annoying,
Remus muttered.
Mysterious,
Sirius argued.
Annoy, never mind,
Remus sighed, leaning forward to hit his forehead against the wood of the kitchen table. Sirius glanced at him and sniggered.
How are we getting there tomorrow?
Remus asked, his face still pressed against the table.
Port key, maybe.
Remus looked up.
I haven't really thought about it. Fine for the way there, but wouldn't that set off the trace on the way home? Damn it!
Sirius muttered.
Whose idea was that stupid tracking spell anyway? I'd like to give them a talking to.
Remus suggested.
No, a good hard kick in the padfoot.
Remus said, looking appalled.
What? Harry's not here to be corrupted, so I figure it's fine.
Remus chuckled and shook his head.
Do you have any suggestions for travel? Night bus. In costumes?
Sirius asked skeptically. He knew the night bus had odd customers, but costumes was pushing it. If nothing else, people would remember them.
Forget I mentioned that one,
Remus muttered. He was wearing an odd expression and Sirius would have bet a substantial amount of gold that Remus was imagining himself on the night bus, in a costume. They were both silent for several minutes.
We could flow,
Remus suggested reluctantly. Port key, no. Apparition, no. Night bus, no. Brooms, no. Even if we had brooms, Harry's never flown before. Muggle transport, no, it'd take too long. Flowing could work. Sirius was forced to concede.
Damn,
he muttered.
Damn indeed,
Remus said, massaging his temples.
But what choice do we have?
Never once did he look at the statue as he walked through the village. He saw it change out of the corner of his eye but didn't look back, keeping his eyes fixed firmly on the church and the graveyard beyond. He approached the grave silently. It was a cold morning, so there was no one around. That was good. Some people might react oddly if they saw him there. He didn't kneel. He hadn't, not once, in all the years he had been coming here. He just stood and read the inscriptions on the headstone. This was more a habit than anything, since he knew every word on them, now. He didn't allow himself to think of the people that lay beneath the ground. Not their faces, not their voices. Not any of the memories he had of either of them. His voice caught. Not out of grief or anything like that, but merely because he hadn't spoken in a long time. He cleared his throat and tried again.
It was nothing personal.
That was all he ever said while he was here. He didn't apologize, why should he? He didn't have anything to apologize for. He didn't try to explain, either. There wasn't any point to that. But, somehow, it seemed important that they knew it wasn't personal. It hadn't been. It had been survival, nothing more, nothing less. And he was good at surviving. He nodded once at the graves and then turned and walked away, out of the graveyard. He needed to get back before he was missed. Not once did he so much as glance at the statue on the way to his apparition point. The statue made him cry every time he saw it, and this time was no different. So young. They'd been so young when they had died. It wasn't fair. Lily and James had been good people. The best people. And Harry. Poor, little Harry, had been sent to live with Muggles. And he'd have stayed there, too, if Sirius hadn't come for him. Poor Harry. He pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at his eyes on his way to the graveyard. He walked carefully between the rows and, when he arrived at the familiar one, bent down. He pulled a bunch of flowers out of his coat pocket and arranged them on the bare grave. He had been given the morning off to collect the flowers and the afternoon off to bring them here. They were nice flowers. Nice flowers for nice people. He found himself needing his handkerchief again. He paused in the village square to give the war memorial time to change. When it had, he edged forward, slowly, to rest his hand on a smaller, cold, stone hand. He stood there in silence for a long time, probably too long, but no one was paying him any attention anyway. Eventually, he pulled away and continued toward the church. He strode toward the kissing gate, not paying even the slightest bit of attention to any of the costumed Muggles. They would assume he, too, was in costume, and ignore him in turn. If they did glance his way, it would be to try to work out what he was dressed as. They could form whatever conclusions they liked. He didn't care. He had other things on his mind today. He pushed the kissing gate open and continued along a familiar route. A bright bunch of flowers already rested there, and he felt the slightest smile creep onto his face. He knelt to the right of the headstone and bowed his head, murmuring things, apologies, mostly, but also promises and every now and then, a curse, but those had no real force behind them. He conjured a flower which he laid down to the right of the others and then moved to the left side of the grave. He murmured a few more words, there were no apologies or promises this time, only curses, and then stood and made his way out. His fingers brushed stone fingers again, before he left for good. She paused by the statue and looked at it. She had never been able to do that before. It was nice, in a sad way. She stared into the stone eyes of the statues and whispered an apology, and then a promise. She repeated the same words to the grave, which felt more binding, since that was where they were buried, but less personal, since she didn't have to hold eye contact with something that couldn't blink. She conjured a bunch of lilies to add to the flowers that already covered the grave and lay them just to the left, since there was already a flower, separate from the others, on the right. She began to talk about her life, where she was living, who her friends were, where she was working, just in case they could somehow hear her. She'd want news too, or death would be frightfully boring.
I'll get him,
she murmured, arranging the leaves of one of her flowers. When it looked the way she wanted it to, she stood and brushed dirt off of her jeans. As she walked back past the statue, back in the village square, she stopped again and cupped a tiny, chubby, stone cheek in her hand. She rested her other hand on the place where two hands, one of which was smaller than hers, the other slightly bigger, met.
I promise. And I miss you.
Unsurprisingly, there was no answer. She wiped her eyes, which were suspiciously damp, on the back of her glove and left. A man and a woman approached the grave and smiled sadly at the flowers resting there, and then at each other. The woman transfigured a stick that was lying nearby into 3 lilies. There were already quite a few of those, a few pale pink lilies with spotted throats and a single white one. None were a bright orange yellow with red throats, like hers. The woman set them down and bowed her head, thinking of the people that lay beneath the stone. Beside her, the man murmured a string of apologies and conjured a cluster of purple hyacinths. He knelt and placed them beside hers but didn't stand for several minutes. He ran his hand over the names cut into the marble, and the words along the bottom of the headstone before he stood slowly. She didn't comment on his tears, nor he on hers. She simply inclined her head to tell him she was ready to go and strode over to visit the statue near the kissing gate. The man made his way there too, but took a different route, one that bypassed 2 other graves. He conjured flowers for them too, the same purple hyacinths, murmured more apologies and then joined the woman outside the graveyard, by the statue. He offered her his arm and they left together.
Here,
Padfoot said, holding out a hand.
Let me do that.
Thanks, Harry mumbled, passing his tie over. Padfoot untangled it, wrapped it around his own neck and, with all of the ease of experience, tied it, took it off, and passed it back. Harry secured it around his neck and then pulled on the dark cloak he had been given to wear. It had belonged to Regulus when he was a bit younger than Harry, who was still short for his age, and Padfoot had given it a higher collar for tonight's purposes, and also charmed the inside to be the same red as the tie. Harry was also wearing a pair of Regulus old dinner clothes, a white ruffled shirt, a black and silver waistcoat and a set of black trousers.
Smile,
Padfoot told him, pulling out his wand. Harry found he couldn't, so he bared his teeth instead. Padfoot muttered something and Harry felt an odd tingling in his mouth.
Just watch your tongue and lips,
Padfoot said. Harry used his tongue to trace his newly sharpened canines.
They're sharp,
he said, testing the words out. His teeth didn't really change the way he spoke, though they would catch on his lip if he wasn't careful. Still, if he had blood on his mouth, he'd look even more vampirish.
They're supposed to be.
Mooney, like Harry, was wearing a set of old dinner clothes, though his had belonged to his Padfoot's dad. Mooney had made them a little baggier, conjured himself a heavy leather coat and also a hat and eye patch. He had also used the charm that Padfoot had once jokingly threatened Harry with to give himself a beard, and had done something to make his hair longer. It rested just below his ears, now, which Harry was used to seeing on Padfoot, but thought looked strange on Mooney. Padfoot was dressed as a werewolf, since Mooney had refused to do it himself. He had cast a charm to put an illusion of a scar on his face and was wearing a shredded shirt that showed off the real scar on his neck and a pair of scruffy jeans. He had done a partial transformation, like he had when Snape visited, to give himself pointy teeth and hairy hands and feet. He had used his wand to make his fingernails grow and to make his ears pointed, which had amused Mooney.
Werewolves do believe in personal hygiene, you know,
Mooney said, glancing at the fingernails.
You could take someone's eye out with those. Now that could be fun,
Padfoot said, grinning scarily. His teeth were quite disconcerting. Harry felt a momentary stab of pity for Snape, but it vanished quickly. Moony secured a pouch to his belt. Inside was enough fluo powder to get the three of them home again.
"Let's go, then,"
Padfoot said, leading the way down to the kitchen. He patted the back pocket of his jeans, where his mirror was.
"I'll go through first and tell you when it's safe to follow."
Harry held James, well, it was his now, mirror up.
"Be careful,"
Moony warned.
"When am I ever not?"
Padfoot said, scooping up a handful of fluo powder from the box on the mantel.
"Well,"
Harry and Moony said simultaneously,
"there was Potter Cottage,"
Padfoot said. He stuck his tongue out at them as he was swallowed by the flames.
"Which time were you going to mention?"
Moony asked, with a wry smile.
"Dunno,"
Harry said sheepishly.
"Probably the time." "Kiddo? Moony."
Padfoot's face appeared in the mirror. Behind him was a wall covered in peeling, creamy yellow wallpaper.
"We're here,"
Harry said, positioning the mirror so that Padfoot would be able to see both him and Moony.
"Everything's fine here. Count to 10 and come through."
The mirror went blank. Harry tucked his into a pocket on the inside of his cloak and then stepped forward to grab a handful of fluo powder. He used his other hand to tuck his glasses into the pocket of his trousers, where his wand was. He tossed the fluo powder into the fire, smiled at Moony, and then said,
"Potter Cottage."
He was tugged away by the fire. He remembered to keep his elbows tucked against his side, but they got bumped anyway. The fire spat him out and he tripped on the hearth and would have landed face first on the carpet if Padfoot hadn't predicted that and darted forward to catch him.
"Thanks,"
he said, rubbing ash off his face. He pulled his glasses out and pushed them back into their usual place. The room came into focus. The walls were those he had seen through the mirror, and the carpet was as dusty as Grimald's had been when they first moved in. To his right were 3 dusty armchairs and a couch, wide enough for 2, maybe 3 people, behind which was a large window that looked out on an overgrown front garden. To his left was a door, through which he could see a kitchen and a dining table, and straight across from him, on the other side of the sitting room, was an empty bookcase. It was likely that the books had all gone into Moony's box, and another armchair. To the right of those was an archway which led into a hallway.
"Out of the way, kiddo,"
Padfoot said, steering Harry away from the fire as Moony stepped out of it. His exit was far more dignified than Harry's had been. Harry shook Padfoot loose, gently, and walked out of the sitting room and into the hallway, where he was immediately met by the sight of a small staircase. The stairs took up most of the hall space, but there was a pram pushed up against the wall to the left of the front door. Harry walked around to the front of the staircase and looked up. It was very quiet upstairs. No surprises there, he thought wryly. Harry glanced back the way he had come. There were 5 doors coming off of the hall. The first led into the sitting room where he could hear Padfoot and Moony talking quietly. The second was the front door, and the third was to the cupboard under the stairs. The fourth led into the kitchen, which he had already had a peek at from the sitting room, and the fifth looked like it led to a bathroom. He could see a dusty floor and tiled walls. With one last, cautious glance over his shoulder, Harry gripped the banister and made his way up the stairs. He was careful to test every step before he trusted it with his weight, slight as that was, because they probably hadn't been used in 8 years. Up the top was a landing with 3 doors coming off it. The far left door was open and showed what Harry thought must have been his parents' bedroom. The middle room had 2 large bunk beds squeezed into it. On the right, closest to the stairs, was a closed door, the only closed door in the cottage. "I wonder why they've closed it," he thought, brushing dust off the doorknob. He felt a stab of guilt for being curious about what was behind it, and then shook himself. "This was my home. If anyone has a right to look inside, it's me." Harry twisted the knob and pushed the door open. Cold air blew into his face.
"Thought he was in the bathroom," he heard Padfoot say from downstairs, and then, more loudly, "Harry."
It very dark inside, but his eyes adjusted quickly and Harry found himself frozen in the doorway staring at the destroyed nursery. There was a crib in the back, right corner, its sides bowed as if something had exploded inside of it. The roof was missing in places, pieces of rubble still littered the worn, moldy carpet, but Harry got the impression that most of it had been cleaned up. The walls adjacent to the crib were in a similarly ruined state, and that was where the cold night air was coming in. Boxes and a comfortable-looking chair had been shoved to one side of the door, and toys and children's books from a ruined shelf above the crib had been placed wherever there was room for them. A tiny broomstick which was snapped half had been shoved under the crib, and a mobile, with little wooden Quidditch players, lay inside the crib, in several pieces. There were noisy footsteps behind Harry, who started and whipped around. It was Padfoot, with Moony just behind him. Padfoot looked from Harry to the nursery and the color drained from his face. Harry found himself wrapped in a tight hug, a hug which just so happened to steer him out of the doorway and enable Moony to close the door again. Harry was grateful. He had had no desire to stand there any longer, but hadn't been able to tear his eyes away, or get his legs to move. "How in Godric's name did I live through that?"
"You don't need to see that," Padfoot said gently, but firmly. That was my room, wasn't it?"
Harry said, when he had found his voice. He still hadn't let go of Padfoot, though he didn't think he could, yet. Hearing Padfoot tell the story was one thing. Seeing the room he'd blow apart when he had destroyed Voldemort, and the relics of his old life, the life he had never had the chance to live, was another thing altogether. And, until he had calmed down, Padfoot was a safe thing to hold on to.
"That's where Voldemort tried to kill me."
Harry felt Padfoot's upper body twist, as if he had turned to look at Moony.
"Yes,"
Padfoot said in a very muted voice, and shifted again.
"Are you still all right to go to the graveyard?"
"Yeah," Harry said, releasing Padfoot a little. When he was certain his legs would hold him, he released Padfoot completely.
"Are you sure?"
Moony asked. Harry noticed his nostrils were flaring slightly. Harry looked away from Moony, but Padfoot was doing the same thing.
"I said I'm fine,"
Harry said. This time, he saw the look they exchanged, though Moony's was only half a look, with his eye patch, and panic prickled inside his chest.
"Come on,"
he said, worried Padfoot might send him home.
"I know you're lying, you know,"
Padfoot said, almost conversationally. Harry was reasonably sure his heart had taken up residence in his shoes, along with his feet. He considered lying about lying, but Padfoot would smell that. And, if he didn't, Moony would.
"I know,"
Harry muttered.
"As long as we're clear,"
Padfoot said and gestured for Harry to head downstairs. Harry didn't know whether to feel relieved that he was still allowed to go, or disappointed that he hadn't been sent home. If he had reacted that strongly to his old nursery, how would he react to the place where his parents were buried? Moony seemed to know what he was thinking. He placed a hand on Harry's shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze. In the hallway at the bottom of the stairs, Moony took his hand off Harry's shoulder and paused to dig through the pockets of his leather coat.
"Aha,"
he said, showing Harry and Padfoot a rusty house key.
I found my old set this morning,"
he explained, shoving it into the lock. He twisted it and the door groaned as it opened. They filed out into the front garden while Mooney locked the door again, just in case, and then carefully navigated through grass that was up to Harry's waist. They took the most direct route to the front fence, knowing they were likely to be noticed if they dawdled. Padfoot vaulted over first. Mooney gave Harry a leg up and Padfoot helped him down on the other side, while Mooney jumped like Padfoot had. From there, it was a simple matter of blending in with the other costumed muggles. Harry spotted a boy in a lion suit, a girl dressed like a rabbit and a man wearing a clown costume so colorful it was almost hard to look at.
"Look!"
said a boy dressed like a ghost. His mother, who was a witch, peered into the bag he was holding. Mooney's nose twitched.
"This way,"
he said, nudging Harry and Padfoot toward the house the boy had just walked away from.
"What did he get?"
Harry asked curiously.
"Chocolate,"
Mooney said.
"We have chocolate at home, gah."
Padfoot jumped, making Harry jump, and pulled his wand out. The skeleton he had brushed swung harmlessly in the breeze, its plastic bones clicking quietly. Mooney chuckled and Padfoot put his wand back into his pocket.
"Bit twitchy are we, Padfoot?"
Mooney asked lightly, ringing the doorbell.
"I am a wanted criminal,"
Padfoot muttered. There were footsteps inside.
"And, in case you need reminding, my last few outings haven't ended terribly well." "Hello,"
a plump Muggle woman said. Padfoot, who had been looking rather grim, gave her a winning smile. Harry glanced at Mooney, who was smiling too, and followed suit. He had never dressed up for sweets on Halloween, so he wasn't quite sure how to go about it. "You would have, if you had grown up here," a little voice whispered. Harry told it to shut up.
"Well, don't you three look dashing?"
she said, beaming at them. She vanished inside for a moment and then returned with 4 Mars bars. Harry and Mooney got one each and the woman blushed before shoving 2 into Padfoot's hands and hurrying back inside. There was a breathless giggle on the other side of the door. Harry, Mooney and Padfoot exchanged bemused looks. Padfoot actually looked quite pleased with himself, and retreated back to the street.
"Unbelievable,"
Mooney said, as Padfoot gave each of them one of his chocolate bars. He still wasn't eating chocolate again after his Dementor's draft ordeal. Harry, however, had no problems with chocolate and unwrapped one of his. They stopped twice more because Padfoot wanted sweets that weren't chocolate. One of the houses was a Muggle one, and they got a handful of boiled lollies each, and the other house belonged to a woman dressed like a witch.
"Abracadabra,"
she said, waving her wand. Padfoot and Mooney flinched but recovered quickly. Harry stared at them, confused.
"Sorry,"
Mooney said smoothly.
"We thought you said something else." "Something unforgivable,"
Padfoot said, watching her closely. The woman clapped a hand to her mouth and Padfoot nodded, as if to himself. Mooney, likewise, seemed to know what was going on. Harry still had no idea.
"Particularly in this village." "Sweet Merlin,"
she said. Harry realized she must be a real witch.
"I'm so sorry. Most of my visitors are Muggles and those that aren't don't know about, I thought you were Muggles,"
she finished in a whisper.
"Otherwise I would never have." "It's quite all right,"
Mooney said calmly.
"You just took us by surprise." "Well, I imagine so."
She peered down at Harry.
"I should have guessed. Those fangs look a little too realistic to be those silly plastic teeth Muggle children put in their mouths."
Her eyes flicked to Padfoot and she cleared her throat nervously.
You're not really." A werewolf?
Padfoot asked. The woman leaned away from him and nodded.
No. I'm not.
The smile she gave them was much friendlier.
Just hold on,
she said, and turned back into the house.
Cow,
Padfoot muttered.
Padfoot.
Mooney hissed.
What's wrong with saying Abra?
Harry started, but then the witch was back and he had the sense to stay quiet.
Here,
she said, giving them each a box of Bertie Bott's every flavor beans.
Now. Thanks for the sweets,
Padfoot said abruptly.
Have a good night. Oh,
she said, her face falling a bit.
Well, good night, then.
She went inside and they trooped back down the path. Padfoot muttered insults under his breath as he tore his box of Bertie Bott's open. Harry couldn't actually hear what he was saying, but his scowl was ferocious and every now and then Mooney would look up, startled. Harry found himself wishing he had better hearing.
Padfoot,
Mooney said, glancing around to make sure no one had heard.
Aside from being rude, I'm reasonably sure that's anatomically impossible. Yes, but it's an interesting concept,
Padfoot said darkly.
Honestly, who talks about that spell here? And asking if I was a werewolf before she brought us sweets. What would it matter? She. What's wrong with abracadabra?
Harry asked, when his curiosity smothered his amusement at Padfoot's indignant speech.
It sounds like a real spell,
Mooney said.
A very bad spell,
Padfoot added. Harry didn't ask for any more details, both of their tones suggested that was a bad idea, and they didn't offer any. Padfoot continued to mutter under his breath. This, at least, was conscious and not at all like the muttering he had done under the influence of the Dementor's draft. Mooney, meanwhile, had opened his box of beans and was sniffing them. When he had found and separated 2 blue ones, Harry had never seen ones that color before. He tossed them at Padfoot, who caught them in his mouth.
Urgh!
Padfoot spluttered, while Mooney tucked the box back into his pocket.
Soap? You gave me soap? Serves you right,
Mooney said. The corners of his mouth twitched and he winked at Harry.
Without magic, it was the next best thing.
Padfoot smiled reluctantly. They rounded a corner and came into a town square. Its only real distinguishing feature was a war memorial, which costumed muggles walked around without really noticing. Harry supposed they saw it every day.
Ah,
Mooney said, staring at it.
Padfoot, I should warn you. Warn me about what?
Padfoot asked.
The war memorial,
Mooney said slowly.
It changes.
Padfoot gave it a curious look and strode forward. Harry made to follow but Mooney's hand stopped him.
Just give him a moment,
Mooney said gently.
What is it?
Harry asked, watching Padfoot, who had just gone very still and had reached out to touch the obelisk, which, now that they were a bit closer, Harry could see was carved with names.
You,
Mooney said, giving his shoulder a squeeze. Me?
Mooney, oh.
As they drew level with the war memorial, it changed into a statue of 2-3 people. He had only just noticed the baby in the woman's arms. James was tall, roughly Padfoot's height, and maybe a tiny bit shorter than Mooney, with hair as messy as Harry's was. And, as he looked at his father's face in person, stone, admittedly, but still, he could very well understand why people said they looked alike. Unlike most of the photographs Harry had seen, James wasn't grinning. He was smiling, a gentle, contented smile, and had one arm around Lily's shoulders and one of his hands resting on top of hers. Lily's face was almost as familiar to Harry as James. After sorting through the box of their old things, he had quite a few pictures with her in them in his bedroom. Even with her hair and eyes colored the gray of the stone they were carved into, she was still very pretty. Her smile, like James, was a little more subdued than Harry was used to, but no less happy. And she was smiling down at the messy-haired toddler in her arms. Harry recognized himself immediately. He had a few of his baby photos now too, and felt his face fall. Here, even more so than in the photographs, he looked just like every other baby he had ever seen, though with James' hair. Here, his statue self was wearing the same contented smile as his parents. Here, he still had his parents, and, though they weren't part of the statue, he had also had Padfoot and Moony. That Harry's gone, though. He died with Mum and Dad. Harry hugged himself and glanced around to see what Moony and Padfoot were doing. Padfoot was staring at the statue with a sad sort of intensity and had one of his hands resting on the place where James and Lily's hands met, over statue Harry's knee. With a jolt, it occurred to Harry that he was allowed to touch the statue and he tentatively reached out to do so. His mother's other hand, the one that was supporting statue Harry's back and legs, was cold and smooth. He curled his fingers over hers and reached for James' hand, which was resting on Lily's upper arm. All the while, statue Harry smiled happily, mocking him.
"Kiddo,"
Padfoot said softly. Harry jumped and let go.
"Moony says the church."
He paused to clear his throat.
"The church is this way."
He held out one arm and Harry ducked under it and hugged Padfoot hard around the waist.
"I know,"
Padfoot said, ruffling his hair.
"I know." "I hate him,"
Harry said into the side of Padfoot's shredded shirt. Tears pricked his eyes but refused to fall. Harry didn't know whether he meant Voldemort or Peter or even baby Harry, for looking so stupidly happy. All Padfoot said was,
"I know."
"They're here," Remus said quietly. Sirius thought he would have noticed it without his help. It was a large, white marble headstone with James and Lily's names and dates. There were also what appeared to be several fields worth of flowers. There were some brightly colored wildflowers, a cluster of pink lilies, some purplish flowers, a single white lily and a bunch of red and gold lilies.
"Many,"
Sirius croaked, drawing Remus' attention to the red and gold flowers.
"Probably,"
Remus said, and Sirius had to admire his composure. Remus had remained calm all night, while Sirius had been struggling to control his mood. He had even got a bit teary at the sight of the statue, but didn't think either of the other two had noticed.
"Should we have brought flowers?"
Harry asked in a slightly panicky voice. Sirius couldn't believe he had forgotten. Just as he himself was starting to panic, Remus said,
"No. Look, they've got plenty there already."
Sirius thought he was rather missing the point.
"Remus, bring some next time,"
Remus said pointedly, his eyes flicking to Harry. "Oh.
"Yeah,"
Sirius said, trying to sound convincing.
"You can be in charge of remembering that, kiddo."
Harry, who seemed to have calmed down, nodded determinedly. Even if Harry forgot, Sirius wouldn't. "They're going to be the best damn flowers anyone's ever had," he promised. Harry, meanwhile, had knelt down in front of the headstone, to read an inscription that had been hidden by the other tributes. "The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death." Sirius read, and then glanced up.
"You chose it?"
he asked Remus, who was surreptitiously trying to wipe his eyes on his sleeve.
"Yes,"
Remus said, grimacing because he had been caught.
What does it mean?
Harry asked.
It means that they embraced death,
Remus answered after a pause. And they had. James had been found in the hallway, wandless, and Lily had been upstairs in front of Harry's crib. While no one but Voldemort or Harry had truly been there that night to see what had really happened, Sirius didn't think it took a genius to work out the rough order of the night's events.
That they were brave, that they defeated death by dying.
Death was a friend for them, Sirius thought, remembering one of the tales from his Anne Regulus old storybook. He shook himself. Well, not quite, but they weren't afraid. A conversation from his Anne James oral exam drifted through his memory, one where James had seriously contemplated coming back as a ghost to watch over his son. Of anything but abandoning Harry, that is. And he's not abandoned. He's got me and Moony now, Prongs, don't worry. And then, the volume of Sirius' thoughts dropped, until it was almost a whisper. And I know I can't replace you, or be what you would have been. But I can be there for him. I can take care of him, make sure he knows how brilliant you were. Sirius swallowed. You bought him life, both of you. He wiped his eyes, not because he was ashamed of his tears, but because he could no longer see and it was uncomfortable. I'm going to make bloody sure that it's a life worth living. Sirius' eyes flicked to Harry, who was still tracing Lily and James' names, and then back to the grave. I promise you.
I promise,
he heard Remus murmur. Sirius glanced over. Remus was watching the back of Harry's head and had tears running down his pale cheeks. Sirius was reasonably sure that he had just promised something similar. On the ground, Harry had started to tremble and Sirius didn't think it was from the cold. He knelt down at his godson's side and gripped his shoulder. As he had by the statue, Harry leaned closer and wrapped his arms around Sirius. Harry sniffled and for a moment, Sirius saw tears dribbling out of Lily's eyes, behind James' glasses. Then, Harry hid his face in Sirius' shirt, and unlike at the statue, or on the landing in James and Lily's cottage, he didn't seem inclined to let go.
You ready?
Sirius asked Remus over his shoulder. Remus nodded, wiping his cheeks. Sirius adjusted Harry's arms around his neck and scooped him off the ground. It's not as easy as parents make it look, he thought, trying not to drop Harry as he stood up. Remus was hovering nearby, just in case, but his help wasn't necessary. Sirius didn't think or whisper a goodbye, he spoke to James and Lily every night before he fell asleep. He'd probably talk to them again tonight. And maybe he was a little bit mad, everyone had always said so, after all, but sometimes, he'd swear they could hear him, and that they were talking back, somewhere he couldn't hear them. Remus slung an arm over his shoulders, careful not to knock Harry, who Sirius thought might actually have fallen asleep, and they made their way toward the kissing gate. A gust of wind, and a warm one at that, considering it was October, blew gently against their faces and Harry shifted slightly, his head lolling back into Sirius' shoulder. His tears had not yet dried on his face but he wore a slight smile, which widened as a second gust of wind ruffled his dark hair. End of chapter. Chapter 32, A Forgotten Favor. November's full moon fell on the 10th, which was Padfoot's birthday. Padfoot hadn't mentioned his birthday at all. Moony later wondered aloud to Harry that he didn't want to turn 30, but Moony had remembered it and so had Creature, who had been the one to tell Harry. Harry and Moony had arranged a trip to Diagon Alley a few days before, telling Padfoot that Moony was going to give Harry a grammar and spelling lesson at his cottage. That was something Padfoot was quite happy not to have any part in if Moony was willing to do it. Harry had had to have his appearance changed at Grimmauld however, because of the trace, and then sneak out, all without Padfoot noticing. In the end, they'd had Creature set Mrs. Black's portrait off, which distracted Padfoot while Harry and Moony left. Diagon Alley was reasonably uneventful. With Christmas next month, it had been busy and so they had been able to blend in easily. Moony had spotted two of Lucius Malfoy's searchers, one they had avoided entirely, and the other Moony had gone up to say hello to, introducing Harry as his nephew. They had chosen a few books, quite a few sweets, though not any chocolate, and then Harry had reluctantly picked out a few pranking items, knowing full well that he'd probably be the victim they were used on. They had also ventured out into Muggle London so Moony could peruse a pet shop.
Keeping tradition alive,
Moony murmured as they made their way to the counter, carrying a box of dog biscuits. Harry had chosen those, a squeaky red ball and a jumper made to fit a dog. Harry had let Moony pay for those, since he had no Muggle money, but had insisted on helping to pay for the things they bought in Diagon Alley. They had gone back to Moony's by Fluo, wrapped and hidden everything, and then, to Harry's horror, he really had been subjected to a grammar and spelling lesson. On the day of Padfoot's birthday, Harry had helped Creature organize breakfast in bed and then Moony came over at lunchtime with the presents. For all that Padfoot had been secretive about his birthday, he had been unbelievably excited to learn they had bought him presents. Harry thought he had torn the wrapping paper off with more enthusiasm than even Dudley had ever managed. Padfoot was pleased with the sweets and the books. One was an updated copy of Quidditch Through the Ages, since Padfoot was a little behind on the league after Azkaban, and the others were Producing Plants, an advanced guide, which Moony thought Padfoot would enjoy, though Harry couldn't work out why, and Mind Games, a Clemency and Legilimency. Padfoot spent several minutes assessing each pranking item and was unnervingly quiet as he did so. Harry just knew he was planning something. The dog jumper and ball were received in good humor. Padfoot chuckled and transformed to try both out, but paused when he reached the biscuits.
"You got,"
he said, looking at Moony.
"Harry picked those, actually,"
Moony told him.
"You're kidding,"
Padfoot said, staring between them, the box still clenched tightly in one hand.
"I'm serious,"
Moony told him.
"Why?" "I'm serious,"
Padfoot said and then hefted the box.
"These are the ones Prongs always bought." "You're kidding,"
Moony said.
"I'm serious,"
Padfoot said, winking. His expression changed remarkably quickly, from joking to sincere.
"Thank you,"
he said.
"I didn't think I'd get another box of these." "It's all right,"
Harry muttered, a little embarrassed that the present he had chosen as a joke had turned out to have such a great sentimental value. Padfoot set the box down with the others and Harry made sure to remember the name so that he could get Padfoot another lot for Christmas. Creature made them an early dinner, since Moony needed to get home before he started to transform, and afterward he brought out the vanilla cake he and Harry had spent the morning making. They sang happy birthday and gulped down a slice of cake each. Padfoot also had a few dog biscuits and coerced Harry into trying one. They were surprisingly tolerable, but Moony refused outright and got rather snappy when Padfoot tried to press the point. When both Moony and Padfoot were gone, and Creature was downstairs cleaning the kitchen, Harry found himself alone and bored. His first full moon had been eventful, due to his kidnapping by Snape, and he had been so exhausted on his second one, because they had spent the day sorting through his parents' things, that he had gone straight to bed. This time, he had nothing to do. He managed to spend an hour helping Creature, though Creature was used to Harry's help in the kitchen by now. He still didn't particularly like the idea, though he coped. When Harry mentioned wanting to cook something, however, Creature became rather distressed and shooed Harry out so that he could do it himself. Creature didn't seem to understand that Harry was more interested in the process of cooking, which would take time, than in the outcome. And so it was, that Harry found himself in the library, lying on the couch, staring at the roof. I bet Padfoot and Moony are having fun, he thought, pushing his glasses up. They were trying to slide down his nose. I wonder what they do on full moons. Do they sit around and bark at each other? Can they understand each other? Or sleep, or go for walks? Suddenly curious, Harry sat up and rolled off the couch. A minute or so later, he was back in the library, clutching his mirror. "Padfoot," he said, and then pulled a face. His reflection pulled one back. "Oops. Sirius Black." The mirror shimmered, and then Harry could see Moony's garden and in the distance, his picket fence and the forest. Padfoot must have left it somewhere, probably leaning against the spare bedroom window if the view was any indication, where he would be able to see it from the garden. Unfortunately, neither of them were in the garden. Harry's face fell a little and he squinted at the forest, trying to make out shapes, but nothing presented itself to him. He let the image fade. It was clever, he thought, the way the mirror sensed its user's intentions, and put the mirror on the table. Disappointed, but thoughtful, Harry went back downstairs, hoping he could pester Creature into letting him help again. Padfoot was late home the next morning. He flew home just after 9, when Harry was about to go through the fire himself to see what was going on. He was supporting a pale, semi-conscious Moony, and sporting a set of painful-looking cuts around his nose and mouth. Harry ran forward to help and together, they managed to get Moony into one of the chairs. "Morning," Padfoot said, touching a cut close to his eye. His hand came away bloody. "Morning," Harry said, hurrying over to the pantry. His hand closed around a bottle of Dittany. "Oh, brilliant," Padfoot said, spotting it. "Do you mind doing it? I can't really see." Harry unscrewed the bottle while Padfoot took a seat and tilted his head back. Harry sat on the table and carefully dripped Dittany into each of the cuts. It was obvious now that they were bite marks. "There," he said, as the cuts hissed and closed over. One on the side of Padfoot's nose left a scar, but the rest healed seamlessly. "Cheers, kiddo." "Is Moony?" "I'm fine," Moony groaned. Padfoot snorted. "It was a bad transformation, both times," he said to Harry. "I'm right here," Moony muttered without opening his eyes. "Can hear you." "I know," Padfoot said cheerfully. "And you would hear me even if I whispered, so there's really no point in pretending." Moony mumbled something that Harry thought might have been a swear word. Padfoot looked confused, obviously he hadn't understood it either, and then shrugged. "Anyway, he only had a small graze on his shoulder because I got snappy when he did this," Padfoot waved a hand at his healed face. "And I healed that already." Moony muttered something else and Padfoot chuckled. "I've dosed him with comforting concoctions and pain-killing potions and a cramp cure, but he's still a bit drowsy." Moony said. Harry smiled. "I figure we'll keep him here until he wakes up, and in the meantime, we can have breakfast." "NNNGH. What?" Harry asked, bemused. "He doesn't want to eat," Padfoot said. "But that's too bad," he added, poking Moony's shoulder. Moony twitched and, several seconds later, lifted a hand to swat in Padfoot's direction. "So, what's for breakfast?" Harry fetched the croissants he and Creature had made the night before and put them in the oven to warm up. The smell of cooking lured Creature downstairs and he sent Harry back to the table while he made tea and saw to the heating. Padfoot inhaled his breakfast and then coaxed Moony into eating a few bites of his croissant. Moony woke up a little and ate with a bit more enthusiasm when Creature set a plate of bacon and sausages down in front of him. Harry had noticed he liked meat more when a full moon was approaching or had just been.
"So what do you do on full moons?"
Harry asked, nibbling on a piece of his croissant.
"Run around in the forest, mostly,"
Padfoot said.
"Wait for it to end,"
Moony groaned, resting his head on his arms.
"Wish to have never been born." "They aren't that bad,"
Padfoot said, rolling his eyes.
"He's just cranky,"
he told Harry, who wasn't sure if Moony was joking or not.
"I can hear you." "I know,"
Padfoot said cheerfully. Moony groaned. Padfoot refilled their teacups.
"Back at Hogwarts we used to explore the grounds and the village, but we're a bit limited with space. If we go too far into Hurtwood, there's a chance we might run into muggles, and since it's only me now, well, we stay pretty close to home. It's all pretty uneventful, really." "I almost bit your face off,"
Moony said into the table.
"Details,"
Padfoot said. Moony gave him a two-fingered salute. Harry sniggered into his teacup.
"Why do you ask?"
Padfoot asked, looking thoughtful.
"Just curious,"
Harry lied. Padfoot arched an eyebrow.
"He's lying,"
Moony said. Harry shot him an irritated look, but Moony was still resting his head on the table. Padfoot's lips were twitching.
"Well?"
he asked.
"I told you, I'm just..." "Lies."
Moony groaned. Harry groaned too, and sank back into his chair.
"Fine,"
Harry said reluctantly.
"I was wondering if, maybe, I mean, you don't have to, but..." "Spit it out,"
Padfoot said, looking entertained.
"Could you maybe teach me to be an animagus?"
Harry said, wincing.
"No,"
Moony said, finally looking up again. He looked quite upset.
"It was bad enough when Padfoot, Prongs, and Wormtail did it. It's too dangerous for you to be running around after me." "There'd be two of us,"
Harry said, gesturing to Padfoot, who was still silent on the matter. That gave Harry hope, because the idea hadn't been shot down straight away.
"He'd be safer too."
He had thought about this last night.
"Assuming you're something big enough,"
Moony said.
"Padfoot, tell him it's a dangerous idea."
Harry noticed he had said it was a dangerous idea, not a bad one.
"The risk's what makes it fun,"
Padfoot murmured, and Moony fell silent. He was wearing an odd expression, now, one that Harry couldn't decipher.
"And if we taught him, it'll be at least a year." "Year?"
Moony asked.
"It took you 3. "We didn't have a teacher,"
Padfoot said.
"We didn't know what books were helpful, the library didn't have the ones that were, remember?"
Moony nodded reluctantly.
"And then we didn't know which method to use and..." "You've made your point,"
Moony said curtly.
"Is that a yes?"
Harry asked hopefully.
"No,"
Padfoot said.
"It's still incredibly complex magic, no matter what method you choose, well above anything you're capable of yet. I think in a few years it's probably a good idea, and Merlin knows it's a damn useful skill to have, but right now, there's no real reason not to, but there isn't really a good reason to do it."
Harry nodded, he had prepared for this.
"All right,"
he said. Padfoot nodded and picked up his teacup, and Mooney put his head back down onto his arms.
Then I'm calling in my favor.
Mooney looked up, confused. Padfoot looked confused too, for a moment, but he eventually remembered the favor Harry was referring to. He swore, rather loudly, and then leaned back in his chair and said,
"Bloody hell! As your guardian, I'm either doing something very right, or very wrong." "Wrong?"
Mooney said at once. Padfoot poked his tongue out.
"And what favor?" "When we first moved here,"
Padfoot sighed,
"there was a misunderstanding that led to me getting Harry to tell me everything about his aunt, uncle, and cousin. He wasn't keen on the idea, so I told him that he could ask me something. I said it could be a question, a favor, or anything else he wanted to ask."
He smiled at Harry, who grinned back.
"Should have known you had made some stupid deal,"
Mooney muttered. Harry hid another smile. There was no venom behind it, it was just Mooney being grumpy for the sake of being grumpy. Padfoot didn't seem offended either, and Harry supposed he was used to post-full moon Mooney.
"So you're teaching him?"
Mooney asked flatly, but he didn't look angry, just worried.
"I'm a man of my word,"
Padfoot said. Oddly, this made Mooney grin.
"Then you should be extremely grateful it's this he's asking for." "Why?"
Padfoot and Harry asked together.
"Padfoot, you promised him anything. It's not an unbreakable vow, but there are still quite a few things he could have asked you to overlook or help him with without being unreasonable."
"Point taken," Padfoot said.
"I should hope so,"
Mooney said, and Harry coughed to hide a laugh.
"All right, kiddo,"
Padfoot said.
"I'll make you a deal." "What deal?" "I'll honor the favor, no changing it or saving it now,"
he added hastily. Mooney laughed, his head was back down, and Padfoot pulled a face at him.
"I'll help you, regardless of when you start learning,"
he said. Harry beamed.
"But, if you want to start learning now, you're funding it. You have to buy everything. If you put this off for a couple of years, until you're 11, I'll buy everything you think you need." Harry thought for a moment. When Padfoot put it that way, it was tempting to wait. But, then again, if he started learning now, it'd cost him, sure, but he'd still have help and he could well be an animagus by the time he was 11. "So if I learn now, I have to pay," Harry clarified. Padfoot nodded. "Using my own money?" "That's sort of implied, yes. And I'll know if you take anything from our stashes," he warned. "I wouldn't steal it," Harry said indignantly. He thought a moment longer and then grinned as a thought occurred to him. "What?" Padfoot asked warily. Harry was still grinning. "I'll pay," Harry said. "Of course you will," Padfoot sighed. "And might I ask how? You get a galleon a week in pocket money, and yes, we've been here a while now, but books on ARandomAudiobookAppeared don't come cheap, and the books you'll need to understand the books on ARandomAudiobookAppeared don't come cheap either." "And you've been spending some of it," Mooney muttered. "It won't be a problem," Harry assured them both. "All right," Padfoot said with a smug look. He thought he had won. Harry knew better. "Get dressed and we'll take you down to Diagon Alley and we'll see how far you can get with 30 galleons." "We're not taking him anywhere, Padfoot," Mooney grumbled as Harry stood up. "You can go book shopping to your heart's content. I am going home." "Is Moonbeam tired?" Padfoot asked in a baby voice. "Poor little." "Sirius, I swear to Godric if you finish that sentence, I really will bite your face off." I'm an idiot,
Padfoot groaned as Harry stepped into his vault and scooped a handful of galleons into a small leather pouch.
You forgot about this, didn't you?
Harry said, gesturing at the vault his parents had left for him.
Idiot,
Padfoot repeated, pretending to bang his forehead on the stone walls.
And you're too smart for your own good. I'll have to be if I'm going to have any luck with this,
Harry said, brushing a strand of brown hair out of his face. Today, he was a short boy with brown hair and brown eyes.
James and Lily are probably laughing at me, right now,
Padfoot whispered, with a wary look at Gerbach, who made no sign that he had heard. 15 minutes later they found themselves in Flourish and Blots, browsing through the dusty shelves for the books they were after. Padfoot pulled Brew or Bewitch, the Animagus choice off of a shelf and passed it to Harry.
If you want to use the spell method,
Padfoot said,
you're going to need to learn Latin. Which one did you do? Spell method,
Padfoot said.
But we used the potion one at the start because we couldn't get the dem meditation process to work. But you don't know Latin,
Harry said, remembering an old conversation.
Nope. Then how? James learned enough to help us out. You don't need to be fluent or anything, but you do need to be able to translate a paragraph properly.
Damn, Harry said.
Bad luck, kiddo,
Padfoot said, and passed him an enormous book called Polish Your Pronunciation and Gild Your Grammar. Harry also grabbed an English to Latin dictionary. Padfoot added a guide to major animal families and their characteristics to Harry's pile.
I can't find Embracing Your Inner Beast,
Padfoot said after another half an hour of walking around the shop.
Do we need it? Hello, there. Hi,
Harry mumbled.
Can I help you, gentlemen?
Asked a wizard with a badge that proclaimed him store manager.
Yes, actually,
Padfoot said.
I'm looking for a book called Embracing Your Inner Beast. Embracing Your Inner Beast.
The manager murmured, before his blue eyes brightened.
I know the one. Do you have it?
Padfoot asked.
Do we have it?
The manager asked, looking insulted.
Of course we do. Brilliant,
Padfoot said, smiling at Harry over his shoulder.
I'd like that, and the 4 of those, then, thanks. I'm not permitted to just hand out copies of that particular text,
the manager said.
If you fill out the application form, we can get a copy to you as soon as it's approved, or you can drop by the improper use of magic office and pick one up in person. It covers complex magic. And this one doesn't?
Padfoot asked, gesturing to Brew or Bewitch.
That one covers the procedure only, and talks about the advantages and disadvantages associated with each of the methods,
the manager said importantly.
The one you're after actually provides you with information that enables you to apply the procedures and begin the transformation process. With it, you could become an animagus. That's sort of the point,
Padfoot said, rolling his eyes.
The ministry uses the book to monitor anyone who's attempting to transform. With that information, they can check in on those practicing to make sure that they're going about it in a safe and legal manner.
Uh-oh, Harry thought.
Right,
Padfoot said.
I'll pick it up after work tomorrow then. Very good, sir. Are you still after those 4?
The manager took the books from Harry, whose arms were beginning to ache, and led them to the counter. While he was ahead, Harry slipped his money bag into Padfoot's hand, and Padfoot used it to pay.
So what do we do?
Harry muttered, as they left the shop clutching 2 wrapped books each.
Peter ended up with our old copy, since he was the last to manage it, so that's out,
Padfoot muttered, leading the way down the street.
Going to the ministry's out of the question. They do wand checks and magical signature analysis if you register, and there's no way I'm risking that. There's one place we could try. Where?
Padfoot tipped a shoulder at a dark space between 2 shops. A sign there said, Nocturne Alley. Harry could just make out people moving in the dim light.
They've got a bookshop, I think,
Padfoot said.
Walpole's. The ministry's been trying to shut it down for years, since before I started Hogwarts, but somehow it stays open. Would they have the book? Probably,
Padfoot admitted.
I've never been there myself, but the fact that the ministry wants to restrict access to it probably means that Walpole wants to share it with everyone. So are we going?
Padfoot glanced around and tugged Harry into a corner. He shrunk the book parcels with a tap of his wand and shoved them into one of his pockets. He then rapped Harry on the head with his wand and started to mutter under his breath. Harry felt himself stretching upward until he was tall, nearly Padfoot's height, and a beard itched on his chin.
Weird,
he said, looking at one of his enormous hands. His voice was deep and a little croaky.
Kids don't go down there,
Padfoot explained, turning his wand on himself. He made his hair black again, and streaked it with silver.
Except for maybe Death Eater kids. Stay close to me, don't wander, don't talk to anyone. Let me handle it. All right. Sure. Keep your wand out.
Harry took a tentative step after him and almost fell. Padfoot managed to steady him and then tapped him once more. Harry's beard turned silver instead of brown.
Keep a hand on my shoulder to help you walk. You can be my father.
Together, they made their way off of the main street and down into Nocturne Alley. The first thing that Harry noticed was the smell. It was a cold, moldy sort of odor and seemed to permeate the entire street. The second thing was the lack of shoppers. There were plenty of people around, but they weren't walking the streets, they were lingering in the doorways of shops, and in little alcoves. One woman was holding a box of what looked alarmingly like dried, human ears. Harry shuddered and moved as close to Padfoot as he could without walking into him. Harry only tripped once, and was instantly surrounded by people trying to help him.
Back off,
Padfoot warned, raising his wand. Several ugly women and an old man stepped back, murmuring about just wanting to help.
Just wanted to help yourselves to his money bag, you mean?
Padfoot growled.
This way, father,
he said. It took Harry a moment to realize Padfoot was addressing him. He gripped his wand and followed, holding Padfoot's shoulder for support. Walpole's was a dingy little shop that Harry would have walked right past if Padfoot hadn't pointed it out. It was wedged between an impressive-looking apothecary and a shop that sold illegal and exotic animals. Harry thought he could see a large green dragon's egg in the window, and a rather scary-looking creature that was a mix between a bird and a lizard. Walpole's was lit by oil lamps which cast sinister shadows on the shelves. The floor was creaky, pale wood, and the shelves were full of dark, leather-bound books, not unlike those in the library at Grimmauld Place. It was much darker than Flourish and Blots.
Wait here,
Padfoot said, stopping beside a wall. Harry figured he could lean on it because he still felt a little wobbly on his feet.
I'll buy it and then we'll go. Do not leave the shop. Okay,
Harry whispered back. Padfoot vanished between 2 rickety shelves.
Can I help you with something?
A tall woman glided out from behind a shelf, startling Harry. She had a high, almost musical voice with a strong Irish accent, and her long, dark hair trailed on the floor behind her. Her most standout feature, however, was her face. She looked like Padfoot had when Harry had first met him, skeletal, with sunken eyes and waxy skin that was orange in the lamplight. Harry said, tearing his eyes away from her.
No. I'm just, oh, here it is.
He grabbed a book off the shelf and held it up.
I've been looking for this one for ages. I see,
the woman purred.
Is that all you're after today? Yes, no. My son's just. Do I make you nervous?
She asked, looking sour all of a sudden.
You?
Harry asked, too puzzled by the question to be nervous about lying.
No. Why?
Her face cleared and she gave him a small smile.
Merely curious. I know I am not as desirable as my French cousins. French? The villa,
she said, shaking her head. Her dark hair rippled down her back and stirred a little dust on the shop floor.
They are more beautiful, yes. I've never seen one,
Harry said honestly, though he thought she was probably right. She was no beauty to look at, but she did seem nice. She gave him another small smile.
What is your name? Harold.
She considered him for a moment and then held out a hand. Harry tucked the book under his elbow so that he could shake it. The handshake was a bit clumsy because Harry wasn't used to his large hands, but she seemed to appreciate the gesture.
What's yours?
Harry asked.
Kira,
she said slowly, tilting her head to examine him better. Harry shifted.
Got it!
Padfoot exclaimed, emerging from behind a shelf. He paused and paled a little when he saw her. She, oddly, had done the same. Harry glanced between them.
Are you ready to go, father?
Padfoot asked.
Sure,
Harry said. Kira gave him an uncertain smile.
Allow me to show you gentlemen to the counter.
She turned and swept down one of the aisles.
Are you all right?
Padfoot hissed.
Fine,
Harry said.
Why?
Padfoot just shook his head.
Oh, we have to buy this.
Harry passed Padfoot the book he had picked off the shelf.
What's this?
Padfoot muttered out of the side of his mouth.
I'll explain later.
Kira showed them to a woman at the counter. Like Kira, she was no beauty. She had a hairy chin, a large wart on her forehead and squinty blue eyes. She gave them a welcoming smile, though, and Harry thought she seemed friendly enough too.
Odd choice,
she murmured, looking at the titles. The book Harry had picked up was Secrets of the Darkest Art. He flushed and Padfoot gave him an odd look.
It's a galleon each for those.
Harry passed the coins over and Kira gave him another curious glance. He looked back at her, confused.
Wrap those for me, dear, would you?
The woman asked.
Yes, Madam Walpole,
Kira murmured. They exchanged places behind the counter and the Madam Walpole gave her a fond smile before going off to return books to their shelves. Padfoot watched Kira's every move, looking interested.
Do I make you nervous?
She asked Padfoot in the same sour tone as she had used with Harry.
A little,
he said, shrugging,
but you seem all right so far.
Kira surprised Harry by smiling faintly.
I was just thinking the same thing, she said. What do you mean?
Harry asked.
No magic can hide my face,
she said, waving a slender hand over her cheeks.
And so, no one can hide their face from me. Do you understand? No,
Harry said.
Yes,
Padfoot said, and swore. She smiled again and passed their wrapped books over the counter. Padfoot tapped them with his wand and tucked them into his pocket with the others. He kept his wand out, pointed at her, though. Harry made a small noise of protest, but Padfoot shook his head. Kira glanced at the wand and then at Padfoot's face.
Not all prisoners are guilty, she said, just as not all banshees are evil.
Padfoot cocked his head and then lowered his wand.
I see,
he said.
See what?
Harry dared to ask. Neither answered him. Kira led them to the door. Harry held on to Padfoot again. Moments before she opened it, she turned and gave them another one of her smiles.
Thank you,
she said, glancing at Padfoot before her eyes came to rest on Harry.
Thank you for not being nervous. You're welcome,
he said, rubbing the back of his neck.
It was nice to meet you,
he added.
It was nice to meet you too, Harry,
she said, smiling.
Perhaps you will come back one day. Thanks,
Padfoot said to her. She opened the door and bowed them out. Only when they were out on the street again, did Harry realize she had called him Harry and not Harold. He turned around, half expecting to see her standing there with a wand leveled. Instead, Kira smiled again and vanished into the shadowy depths of the shop.
So, secrets of the darkest art? Something you want to tell me about? She wanted to know why I was standing around and I just grabbed it off of the shelf,
Harry muttered.
Sorry, okay.
Padfoot's shoulders shook under Harry's hand as he laughed. Harry pulled a face at the back of Padfoot's head and they made their way back to the leaky cauldron so that they could flow home. Remus had assumed his standard, post-full moon position, lying on his couch, staring at the roof. As was also becoming standard, he was disturbed. He had been dozing when he had heard the window creak. Assuming it was just Strix, he had settled back in, but then he had heard a thump and footsteps.
Yes, Dora?
He asked, and the footsteps stopped.
How'd you know it was me? Only you and Mad Eye come in through the window and I couldn't hear his leg. Fair enough,
she said, moving into his line of sight. She tripped on her feet as she did so, and landed clumsily on the couch opposite his.
Why did you use the window, by the way?
He asked.
Mad Eye's orders. Keep you on your toes. Are you all right? You're pale. Tired,
Remus said.
And if you don't mind me saying, you look rather pale yourself.
She scrunched up her face and forced color into her cheeks.
Better. Honestly?
He asked. She nodded.
You look sunburned.
Her hair flashed pink and the pink in her cheeks faded to a healthier shade.
I thought you had the program this afternoon. We went to Azkaban this morning,
she said quietly. Her hair turned a dull gray and her face went a chalky color.
They gave us the rest of the day to recover. Is it that bad?
Remus asked.
It's freezing out there, and it's windy and oh, Remus, it's the most horrible place I've ever been. I thought I was going to go mad and I was only there for a few hours. There's no color at all. Everything's gray.
She paused suddenly.
You've never been? No. Why? You're so worldly. I just assumed. You assumed I had gone to satisfy my curiosity?
He asked, smiling. Her hair was pink again, and she nodded.
It's flattering that you think I'm so adventurous,
he said. She grinned.
But no, unfortunately, or fortunately, really, I've never been to, or had any desire to visit Azkaban. Well, I wouldn't recommend it.
Neither would Sirius, Remus thought.
Noted,
he said and then glanced at her pale face again.
Would you like some chocolate? It helps. Mad Eye gave me some,
she said, shaking her head.
How much?
Remus asked. He took an inconspicuous sniff and then sneezed. She smelled like death, if that was possible, and also, very faintly of chocolate, indicating that, while she had had some, it probably hadn't been much. He was surprised at Mad Eye, who was usually generous with remedies of any sort.
A whole block. Did you eat it all?
He asked shrewdly.
Well, I sort of shared it,
she said sheepishly.
Ben and Melvin only needed a bit, but McKinnon and Florence found it pretty tough. And so, being the good Hufflepuff you are, you shared,
Remus surmised.
So I repeat, would you like some?
She gave him a guilty, slightly pleading smile which Remus took to mean yes. He summoned, because he didn't feel like moving, a block of Honeydukes' best and offered it to her. She offered to pay for it, but Remus refused, even more adamantly than he might have, because she was offering sickles again and he was not in the mood. She finished. Admittedly, he helped a fair bit, the whole block in a few minutes, and he was amused to notice her hair had changed from grey to a rich brown.
So,
he said, crushing the foil into a ball,
did you come for my chocolate or is there something else I can help you with? The chocolate,
she said, grinning, and then sobered.
Actually, I wanted to see if you were all right. I'm fine,
he said automatically.
Why wouldn't I be?
Unfortunately, his voice chose that moment to struggle.
You tell me,
she said, narrowing her eyes. Then she sighed.
It's just that you've missed a few days with the search lately and I thought, since I had the afternoon off. If it's none of my business, that's fine, but I thought I should make sure you were all right.
Remus felt mild irritation at being babied, but it was weak in comparison to how touched he was. He could count on two hands the number of people who had ever expressed such genuine concern for him. He could count on one hand those that were still alive. In fact, he was touched enough to share several half-truths.
On Halloween,
he said, noticing that she looked surprised that he was offering the information,
I was visiting Lily and James. It's always a hard day for me. I wouldn't have been much use searching at all, I'm afraid.
She gave him a sad look.
And then yesterday I wasn't feeling well, so I thought I'd better not push it, and I'm glad I didn't. I had a pretty uncomfortable night, to be honest. I think I'm on the mend though.
She smiled.
I'm almost positive it's a 24-hour thing.
As in, 24 hours a day, every day. But she doesn't need to know that.
And the one about a month ago?
She asked gently.
Something similar, he said. I've been stressed about Harry and Sirius.
Which was not, technically a lie.
So that probably hasn't helped, but it's all right, really. If there's anything I can do to help, I'll keep it in mind,
he said smiling.
Speaking of assisted recovery and everything,
she said a moment later,
have you heard from Matt? Is he He'll be back next week,
Remus told her. She looked relieved.
Good,
she said.
It's been so quiet without him around. Did you know?
Remus knew exactly what she was talking about.
Yes,
he said, watching her carefully.
Does it worry you? No,
she said thoughtfully. He believed that she believed that, but thought time would tell whether it was true or not.
I just...
She cocked her head.
Did it surprise you when you found out? I don't really remember,
Remus said, because that was the easiest answer.
It surprised me,
she admitted.
He didn't seem like the type, or... I don't know, I just didn't see it coming. It's always the last ones you expect,
Remus told her, because he couldn't help himself. End of chapter. Chapter 33, An Overdue Explanation. Secrets of the Darkest Art was a source of Padfoot's amusement for almost a month. Harry didn't know how he could find it even remotely humorous after the first day, but he did. Harry thought he'd have stopped sooner if Harry wasn't so embarrassed by the whole ordeal. The first few weeks, at least twice a day, he took to doing impressions of Harry. He'd stand around somewhere, and wait for either Harry or Moony to ask what he was doing, before doing a passable imitation of Harry's stuttering and producing the book from somewhere nearby. By the beginning of December, he had progressed to reading the blurb aloud in a sinister voice. Harry thought he had heard it enough times to recite it, and, by mid-December, he was brave enough to actually open the book. With Padfoot being Padfoot, it had only been a matter of time. Harry was in the kitchen, poring over Embracing Your Inner Beast for instructions on how to make the potion that, if he made it properly, would allow him to see his animal form. He had decided to use the spell method, which involved the creation of a spell that would change him into an animal, but use the potion to find his form, instead of the meditation, which Padfoot firmly maintained did not work. Padfoot was in the seat opposite him, holding Secrets of the Darkest Art and reading from the contents page. Harry knew from the blurb that it contained quite a bit of dark, destructive magic, and was seriously thinking about using some of it to get rid of the stupid book. Moony, who was in the seat next to Padfoot's, and was having a late lunch, courtesy of Creature, was thoroughly amused by the whole process.
Oh, look,
Padfoot said.
Necromancy. Very useful, don't you think, Moony? Shut up,
Harry muttered, without looking up from the page he was reading. He sensed rather than saw Padfoot's grin.
Very,
Moony agreed tiredly, winking at Harry, who quickly looked down again. Moony had been entertained by the story of how they found the book and impressed that Harry had managed to befriend a banshee. Moony leaned over to read something else off the page.
And the Unforgivables are here. How nice. Brilliant book choice, Harry, I must say. Truly commendable,
Padfoot agreed. Harry pulled a face at him and silently promised to slip something into Padfoot's tea that afternoon.
Tell me again how you found this one.
And something in Moony's tea too, he thought.
What are the Unforgivables, anyway?
Harry asked.
Read chapter 4 and find out,
Padfoot said slyly. Harry pulled another face and Padfoot pulled one back.
And then?
Padfoot made a funny choking noise and set the book down on the table.
What?
Harry and Moony asked. Padfoot swallowed once, grey eyes wide, and turned the book around so that they could see it. Then, he pointed to chapter 7. Written there, on the contents page, was the Horcrux. Harry was as stunned as the others, no point denying that, but through his shock, he uncovered another emotion. Vindication.
Look, a chapter about Horcruxes,
he said archly, in the same tone both Padfoot and Mooney had used before.
Interesting topic, don't you think? Worth reading about at the very least? Good thing we bought. Oh no you don't,
Padfoot said.
Don't you even try to justify. Don't start,
Mooney said wearily. The full moon had only been 2 nights ago and he was still recovering.
Just read.
Padfoot pulled a face at him, and then rolled his eyes at Harry, who was still feeling smug, before pulling the book over again and flicking through to the specified page.
The Horcrux,
Padfoot began in a spooky voice.
Through. Serious,
Mooney sighed.
You're no fun,
Padfoot whined, but he read on in his normal voice.
Throughout history, man has always sought immortality, and of the available methods, the creation of a Horcrux has proven to be the most effective of these.
He looked up and arched his eyebrows at them before continuing.
The first known Horcrux was created in ancient Rome by the wizard Longinus, who served the emperor of the time. Longinus killed the emperor and used his death to secure his own immortality and his place as emperor. What are they, though?
Mooney asked, though he looked fascinated. Padfoot shrugged and kept reading.
Longinus' death was a true accident. He was engaged in battle when a fire, believed to be fiend fire, destroyed the hiding place of his Horcrux. Almost simultaneously, scholars argue there was a conspiracy in motion. His lung was pierced with an arrow and, believing himself to be immortal, Longinus refused help, ordering his healers to help the other soldiers. He died from his wound the next day. Cheerful read, this.
Padfoot muttered, and then cleared his throat.
It is believed Longinus revealed the secrets to his long rule to Wahank, an Egyptian priest, who lived for an astounding 350 years, almost 12 times the life expectancy of that period. Wahanka's writings reveal a secret life which he kept hidden in an amulet he wore on his person, and this is believed to be the second Horcrux to ever exist in the history of wizarding kind. Horcruxes, being simpler to make in ancient times due to the harsh lifestyle and the frequency of wars, were prevalent for several hundred years. Wizards of significance were assumed to have one as a precaution, and this was accepted by the wizarding community. By the 1600s, Horcruxes were less common, however, and by the 1700s, they were frowned upon, before a cross-continental law was established in 1786, banning the creation of Horcruxes. The Department of Mysteries belonging to the British Ministry of Magic, the Chinese Department of Magical Exploration and the North American Magical Anomalies Sector all united in the early 1800s to purge the world of Horcruxes and their creators. We get it, all the evil kids died,
Padfoot said to the book.
Now, what are they? You've got the book,
Mooney said. Padfoot scowled and fell silent, scanning the page. After a moment, his eyes stopped moving, he was staring, rather than reading.
Fuck,
Padfoot whispered.
Did you find it?
Yep, Padfoot said faintly. His face had turned the color of parchment, his jaw was so tight that Harry half expected his teeth to crack, and he was holding the book so tightly that his knuckles were white.
Well, what is it?
Harry demanded.
Is it something bad? You might say that. Well?
Mooney asked impatiently.
It's soul,
Padfoot said, with enormous eyes.
It's a piece of soul in an external container. Tell me that's a joke,
Mooney said, while Harry stared at Padfoot, horrified.
Padfoot. One must split the soul through an act of deliberate murder, and ensure no remorse is felt.
Padfoot read.
Remorse mends the damage.
His eyes flicked back and forward, obviously he was only reading certain parts of the book.
Should the caster follow the correct instructions, they will be able to embed half of their soul in another object. Throughout history, Wizards have chosen objects of significance to guard their souls, some even choose animals or people. So long as the soul and its shelter are intact, the creator cannot die.
That's disgusting, Moony said flatly.
Who kills someone to prolong their own life? Never mind that,
Harry said, feeling ill.
If that's true, then we've got a piece of Voldemort's soul sitting in the drawing room. Holy Hufflepuff,
Padfoot said weakly.
I touched the damn thing. And no wonder it attacked you, after what you did to him. Does this mean he's definitely coming back?
Harry asked, rubbing his scar. He wasn't quite able to keep the trepidation out of his voice.
I mean, if he's got a Horcrux then he's immortal, isn't he? He can't die. And either must die at the hand of the other.
Padfoot murmured, glancing at Moony. Moony's eyes widened.
You don't think? It's possible, isn't it?
Padfoot murmured.
If the second part isn't actually about him. It could be about his soul,
Moony finished.
Yes, it's possible. Who? And who's dying?
Harry interrupted.
Voldemort, hopefully,
Padfoot said, with a grim smile.
Does it say anything about destroying it?
Moony asked, tapping the book. Padfoot picked it up again and browsed through for several minutes. The revolted, disbelieving look on his face was almost comical, or would have been, if Harry didn't know that he was probably learning how to extract souls.
There are two ways,
Padfoot announced, finally.
The first is remorse, fat chance of that ever happening.
Moony snorted.
And the other is to put the Horcrux beyond magical repair. But magic can fix everything,
Harry said. Padfoot's mouth turned down.
No,
Moony said.
Not everything. Thought they might have slowed down a bit because Christmas is only 12 days away, but apparently not,
Dora said.
At least you won't get bored,
Remus said.
I don't mind,
she said, jamming her hands into her pockets, they were probably cold. His were nice and warm, though he wasn't wearing gloves. A slightly warmer than normal body temperature had its advantages in winter, though it was unpleasant in summer.
I knew it would be intensive. I'm just a bit surprised. I had more spare time when I was doing my NEWTS.
Remus chuckled.
Be thankful you aren't in the accelerated program. James and Sirius were studying every day and I had other friends who were in the program during their NEWT year. And Keith thinks I work a lot.
Remus chuckled again.
Are you still seeing too much of Helga? Yes,
she said.
But it makes up for not seeing much of Keith himself at the moment, so it's all right. Are you fighting?
Remus asked, concerned.
No, just busy,
she sighed. They separated around a line of school children and then came back together again.
I have training all day tomorrow and then I'm at Mad Eye's tomorrow night. Go home,
Remus said.
What? Go home,
he repeated.
Surprise Keith or something. Have a break.
She looked tempted but shook her head.
I can't. I'm here to work. It's 1 o'clock now. We've got 10 minutes until lunch and then a few more hours of walking this same route.
Remus couldn't wait until the new year, when he'd no longer have to do it.
You won't be missing much. Last time I left early Sirius showed up,
Dora said, frowning.
Personally, I think that probably traumatized him as much as it did me,
Remus said, giving her a small smile. She slipped on a patch of concealed ice and he caught her arm without breaking pace. She grinned and thanked him.
It's all right. He'll be lying low for a while yet. But... Go on,
Remus said.
I've had you cover my mischiefs more times than I can count. I can handle a few hours alone. It wouldn't be right.
The roots of her hair were turning an odd turquoise color, obviously it indicated indecision.
Dora,
he said, smiling.
Go.
She bit her lip.
Dora. Remus.
He waited.
Fine.
She huffed.
Fine, I'll go. But you had better not run into Malfoy. And if Sirius shows up, so help me Merlin. It'll be fine,
Remus assured her. She seemed to deflate.
Thanks,
she said, offering him a smile. He smiled back and then she pulled a face.
Arabella's going to think I've run off to play with Sirius. No, well, all right, she probably will. Just when she was starting to like me again, too.
Dora laughed and then sighed.
I'll tell her your mum's sick,
Remus said.
That one always works. Tell her my cat's sick,
Dora suggested, grinning.
You want her to believe the story,
Remus told her,
not go rushing to your house to help you nurse your cat.
She laughed and then, looking thoughtful, added,
with Canis it would take two. You actually have a cat?
Remus asked, surprised.
He's a horrible little creature,
she said cheerfully. Well, that explains why she never smells like one, Remus thought.
Are you sure? Positive,
Remus said.
Now go home, before I take you myself.
She pulled a face at him and glanced around for Muggles before vanishing with a popping sound. Remus smiled at the place where she had disapparated and then continued along the street they had been walking. The last 15 minutes of his search route was boring without her but not unpleasant. He made his way back to the Leaky Cauldron at lunchtime to find it packed with customers. Thankfully, Arabella, Debbie and Dirk had already secured a table and had ordered a plate of sandwiches to share.
Where's Theodora?
Arabella asked, pursing her lips.
Where's Matt?
Remus asked at the same time. They both laughed and Debbie and Dirk looked amused.
Haven't seen him,
Arabella said, shrugging.
Theodora's mother old,
Remus countered.
She's not well, so Dora's gone home to make sure she's all right. I told her to have the afternoon off.
Arabella pursed her lips and it was clear to Remus what she was thinking, though thankfully she didn't voice it. After Remus had agreed to talk to Dora, a talk which had involved him explaining that Arabella was suspicious of her, he had told Arabella that she was trustworthy, and that he didn't want to hear any more unfounded accusations. Thus far, she had listened and kept her mouth shut.
I'm going to go,
Debbie announced, standing up.
I'll search the streets around the outside of the pub, if that's all right. Perfectly fine,
Remus said, smiling at her.
You don't want lunch?
Dirk asked. Debbie shook her head. Spending lots of time in the pub made her uncomfortable, because, though she was a werewolf, she was still technically a muggle.
See you all tomorrow, she said.
Remus, Arabella, and Dirk talked about non-search-related things while they waited for Tom to bring them lunch. Matt still hadn't arrived by the time the sandwiches had and Remus was beginning to feel uneasy. Matt was easily distracted, though he usually tried to stay in contact. Arabella seemed certain that he had stopped searching to talk to a girl somewhere, and while Remus agreed that it was possible, he'd have expected a message if that was the case.
"Here's lunch,"
Tom said, setting down a plate loaded with sandwiches.
"Also, I've got a message for you, Remus, from that boy who comes in lots. Matthew." "Did he come in?"
Remus asked.
"Been and gone,"
Tom said, nodding.
"'Bout 20 minutes before you lot started getting here."
He gestured to Dirk and Arabella, who were eating with relish.
"Was he alone?"
Arabella asked, swallowing.
"No,"
Tom said.
"He." "Ha!"
Arabella said, returning to her lunch.
"Told you, Remus. He's fine." "Was with his father,"
Tom continued. Remus' sense of unease peaked.
"Mr. Matthew."
Remus assumed Tom was referring to Matt's father.
"Was in a bit of a rush, but the lad had the time to give me this."
He passed over a piece of scrunched parchment, which Remus opened and smoothed out on the table. "Remus," it said, in Matt's messy scrawl. He had always had the most abysmal handwriting, and this was worse than usual, because it had obviously been written quickly. "Gone camping. Matt." Remus thanked Tom, who shuffled back to the bar, where a line was beginning to form. Remus reread the message several times, sure Matt had meant more than what he had said, but had no idea what. Was it some sort of code? Or, had Cornelius actually taken his son camping? If so, why hadn't Robin been with them? Or had Tom forgotten to mention that? Arabella and Dirk had eaten their fill while he contemplated the parchment on the table, though they had left him quite a few sandwiches that he picked at half-heartedly, and left together almost immediately after, discussing a new law that Dirk's department was trying to get through the Wiesengamot. Remus sat alone, pondering the 4 words Matt had left him, when a shadow moved over him. He looked up, and then hastily rearranged his frown into a smile, although this was the last person he felt like talking to. Malfoy smiled back, coolly.
"Lupin," he said. "Lucius,"
Remus replied mildly.
"How are you?" "Healthy,"
Malfoy said, pulling a blonde hair off of his robes. He pulled out the chair Dirk had occupied and sat, wearing his usual sneer. Remus didn't wait for him to ask back, he knew it would never happen.
"How can I help you?" "I'm not pleased with the progress the search has made, frankly,"
Malfoy said, curling his lip.
"I'd expected results, and yet, 9 months and we're no closer to having either of them." "I know,"
Remus said, trying to sound frustrated. It wasn't all that hard, he really didn't like Malfoy.
"So what are you planning to do about it?" "Keep a closer eye on the searchers."
Remus' stomach flopped unpleasantly.
"You'll look into mine, I'll look into yours. That way I'll be certain that you're not protecting any of them. You'll tell yours that I'm interested to see where my money's going."
The way that he sneered made Remus think that he didn't care much at all.
"And I'll tell mine that you've been promoted and will be spending a little bit of time with all of them to learn the routine." "So I'll be spying on them?"
he asked. Malfoy nodded.
"You'll be investigated yourself,"
he added casually.
"Some of my search team will be instructed to investigate you while you're investigating them, and I'll also judge you based on the way your team of misfits performs without you directing them. If they catch Black a day after you leave the group, I'll know you've been holding them back."
His grey eyes glinted. Unlike Sirius, which were a warm grey, Malfoy's were like steel, cold and hard.
"Should that be the case, I'll see to it that you share a cell." "Who'll be leading the Muggle search then?"
Remus asked, as if he didn't know already.
Talk? That is, if you think she can handle it. She's capable,
Remus admitted grudgingly.
Good,
he sneered.
I must go, I don't want to catch anything.
Remus rolled his eyes.
I'll have more information for you tomorrow morning. You're to be here at 8 and then we'll discuss a day for our weekly meetings.
He swept away and Remus pulled a face at his back. He was partly relieved, though. Malfoy had effectively set Dora up to take his place, and he'd surely be released from his job as a searcher as soon as the investigation was finished. If he was quick about it, he could get the screening process done before Christmas, and that would leave him free to go to the camp without having his every move monitored. Gone camping. Remus stuffed the note into his pocket and launched out of his seat.
Excuse me,
he said, stepping around a woman who was waiting to order.
Tom. The man Matt was with, what did he look like? Nymphadora.
Mum shouted.
Don't call me that. And what?
Tonks shouted back, pulling away from Keith.
Door.
She sighed and stood, giving Keith an apologetic look. He shrugged, but she thought he looked a little disgruntled. He stood too, and followed her out of her bedroom and into the hall. As she walked, she tried to work out who could possibly be coming to see her, and why it couldn't wait until tomorrow. It was almost 9. She stopped abruptly and Keith stepped forward, as if to protect her, before recognizing the visitor.
There you are,
Mad Eye growled. Mum turned around, looking relieved. She had probably been trying to make small talk, which Mad Eye would have been abysmal at. Mum retreated back to the sitting room, where Tonks heard Dad ask who was there.
Yeah,
she said.
Watcher. Let's go,
he said, and limped out again.
Go?
She asked.
Where? Why? Constant vigilance.
He bellowed, turning back around.
You should always be ready to move at a moment's notice. I won't say where in case unwelcome ears are listening.
His blue eye lingered on Keith long enough for Tonks to notice before moving away again.
As for why, because I said so.
Keith jumped.
Fine,
she said.
Just let me summon my cloak.
She flicked her wand down the hallway and her cloak came zooming toward her. Canis was holding onto it for dear life. Obviously he had been sleeping on it when she summoned it. She pried his claws free and dropped him back onto the ground. He immediately wound himself around Keith's legs and mewled until Keith picked him up.
It's 9 o'clock.
Keith protested, as she put her cloak on. Canis snuggled into his arms, and managed to glower at Tonks while doing so.
And?
Mad Eye asked.
So you can't force her to work now. Don't go.
Keith said, turning to Tonks.
It can wait until morning. Can it?
She asked Mad Eye.
No,
he growled, but he actually looked a little bit worried. Tonks had 1,000 questions she wanted to ask, but she didn't think Mad Eye would take it well if she asked them in front of her boyfriend.
Of course he'd say that,
Keith muttered.
I have to go,
she said, grimacing.
Sorry. I swear you're always working,
he sighed, stroking Canis' furry head.
At least we got the afternoon,
she said, offering him a smile. He smiled back. Tonks left both Keith and Mad Eye waiting while she went to explain what she knew, which was very little, to Mum and Dad. When she returned to the hallway, Keith was still holding Canis, and both of them were glaring at Mad Eye, though Canis' glare was on her the moment she moved into his line of sight.
"What time will you be back?"
Keith asked her.
"Can't say,"
Mad Eye told him.
"No use waiting around for her, though, I'll tell you that much."
"Sorry," Tonks told him. Keith just sighed.
"Nymphadora,"
Mad Eye said impatiently.
"Sorry,"
she muttered.
"I'll see you later."
"Bye," Keith said gloomily, and leaned in for a kiss. Tonks hesitated, wondering what Mad Eye would have to say about that sort of romantic display, but in the end decided he could just deal with it. Mad Eye had other ideas. As she leaned in, Mad Eye grabbed her arm and paraded them both away.
"Mad Eye!"
she exclaimed, when the squeeze of apparition ended. She tripped and landed on something soft and cold, snow. She shot right back up, only to have the snow start to seep in through her socks. She really should have worn shoes.
"Get up,"
he said, hauling her to her feet.
"What's going on?"
she asked, using his arm to steady herself.
"You'll see,"
he said, leading her into the house. Of all the things she expected to find waiting there for her, Remus had been the last. And yet, there he sat, looking scared and defiant and uncomfortable all at once.
"Remus?"
she asked.
"Dora,"
he said absently. Mad Eye limped out, leaving them alone. Tonks muttered a hasty charm to dry her socks and sat down next to him on the couch.
"Watcher? What's wrong?"
she asked.
"Quite a bit,"
he said grimly.
"I need to tell you something." "Well?"
she asked after a pause.
"I'm sorry for disrupting your evening,"
he said in a very small voice. He looked so miserable that she had to smile a little.
"It's fine,"
she said.
"But I guessing there's more to it than that. So what's going on?" "Oh Merlin,"
he muttered.
"Well, you know how Matt's a werewolf."
"Yes," she hedged.
"Is he all right?" "No. But I have to tell you something about myself first." "Are you a vampire?"
she asked.
"What? No,"
he said, shaking his head. She flushed.
"Sorry, stupid question,"
she muttered.
"I just thought you were about to confess to being a magical creature, never mind." "I am,"
he said, still sounding off.
"I'm a magical creature. I'm a
he muttered the last word.
"Speak up,"
she said, frowning.
"I missed that."
He groaned and buried his face in his hands. He inhaled noisily.
"I am a werewolf,"
he said finally. And there it was again, fear and defiance. It was an odd mix, and suddenly it occurred to her that Remus, who had been so sure of his morals that he was prepared to die for them in the war, and Remus, who seemed so quietly confident in the way he led his search team, was afraid of her. Or, afraid of what she'd think.
She
said, pressing her hands to her chest, and allowing her hair to grow several inches and turn a bright tomato red.
"What big eyes you have, grandmother!"
Remus stared at her.
"And what big ears you have!"
she prompted.
"No. Big teeth. What if Mad Eye comes in, wielding an axe?" "What?"
he managed to say.
"Little Red Riding Hood,"
Tonks said.
"It's a muggle." "I know what it is,"
he said, still staring at her.
"I just can't believe you've said it." I was a big fan of Muggle fairy tales,
she admitted.
I always wanted to be a princess. Is that odd? A princess or an auror? Odd combination, I suppose, but it made sense to me. Not that Little Red Riding Hood's a princess, but... How can you be taking this so well?
Remus demanded. She frowned.
Did you expect me to take it badly?
She asked.
Yes. Really? Why?
She laughed, but she was a little hurt that he had thought that.
Do I seem like the type to judge you for something like that? No,
he muttered.
I suppose not.
He laughed a little shakily.
Sorry. You should be,
she said.
But I forgive you.
He smiled gratefully.
So how long have you been a werewolf? I was 4 when Greyback bit me,
he said, a little tersely. Since Remus was about Sirius' age, roughly 30, Tonks thought, that meant he had been a werewolf for 26 years.
25 years.
He added. 29, then, she amended.
Hey,
she said. And then something else clicked.
So that's why you've been sick so much?
He grimaced and nodded.
Why didn't you say anything before? Why do you think?
He asked, rubbing his temples.
I'm a monster. Rubbish,
she said flatly.
I did some reading when I found out that I'd be helping Mad-Eye with the Greyback case, and as far as I can tell, you're no more dangerous than any other human when you're not in wolf form. We have better senses,
Remus protested.
That's a tactical advantage. Sure it is, she said. But none of those are actually going to cause any damage on their own. Our bites haven't been proven to transmit lycanthropy when you're in human form,
she said. Remus' eyes narrowed.
You really did read,
he said.
Of course I did. Good thing too, or you might have been successful in planting those few seeds of doubt. I don't get it, do you want me to be afraid of you? I want you to understand the extent of my condition,
he said.
So many people treat it like a joke. But do you want me to be afraid of you? Of course not,
he said.
But if you were, I'd understand completely. Well,
she said, dropping her eyes,
there's one thing I'm a little bit worried about. What?
Remus asked. His expression was unreadable. She glanced up with a pig snout nose and said,
I'm afraid you'll huff and puff and blow my house down. Very funny,
Remus said irritably, while she laughed.
It was a good one,
she insisted, clutching her sides. He smiled reluctantly and then she forced herself to be serious.
Now that you've told me that, what's wrong with Matt?
Remus' slight smile slipped right off of his face and he leaned back into the couch.
You know about Greyback's camp?
He asked wearily.
So it does exist?
Tonks asked. Remus gave her an odd look.
I thought it might have been a myth,
she said defensively.
It sounds surreal. It exists,
he assured her.
And surreal is a very good word for the things that happen there. You've been?
She asked.
I have. So you know where to find Greyback? Dora,
Remus said.
I'm not giving you that information. Mad-Eye asked me the same thing when he was assigned the Greyback case, and again when Matt was attacked. If I thought more harm than good could come of it, I'd give him up in a heartbeat, but it's not worth it. Fine,
she said, deflating.
Matt's at the camp,
he said.
What?
She asked.
After Greyback nearly killed him. What's he thinking? I doubt he had much say in it at all, to be honest. Generally, we go after Christmas and stay until February, which keeps Greyback happy, but he's obviously feeling threatened by Matt at the moment. Merlin knows why, and wants him somewhere he can keep him in submission. And obviously he had worried enough that he's forced him to be there a week early. So we'll steal him back. You know where to find him, and then what?
Remus sighed. She wondered if he had already considered it and had to admit that he probably had.
Hide him? Greyback would find him eventually, and he does not take defiance well. So you're leaving him there?
Remus muttered something about Hufflepuff and then, more loudly, said,
No. I'm going early too, to make sure things are under control. Hopefully that upsets Greyback enough to keep him at the camp for the entire time we're both there, and that'll reduce his victims, at least in the short term. But what about the search?
Tonks asked. Remus laughed humorlessly.
Funny you should ask. I bumped into Malfoy this afternoon. Of course you did,
she groaned.
Did he ask where I was? No, actually. Probably assumed I was sick of your company,
she said, grinning. He smiled.
Hang on. He knows about you being a werewolf, doesn't he?
Remus nodded stiffly.
That's why he doesn't like you.
Remus nodded again.
And speaking of Malfoy, he's decided to investigate everyone involved in the search. When?
Tonks asked, resigned.
I'm supposed to start tomorrow morning,
Remus sighed.
Tomorrow?
Tonks asked, pulling her knees up to her chest.
But I thought you were going to go after Matt. Oh. You're supposed to take over my job,
he said.
I'm sure Malfoy will get around to telling you eventually, but maybe now you can prepare for it. And then I'll stay in the position, won't I?
She asked. Remus nodded, his expression unreadable. She felt another stab of guilt for taking his job.
I'm really. Don't worry about it. How? I could smell it,
he said.
Oh.
Several other little things about his condition clicked into place, but she ignored them for the time being.
So what are you going to do about tomorrow? You can't risk Matt, but if you leave now it'll look like I'm running. Exactly. You see my problem. And Matt's, really, because it's going to look like he's run from the investigation too.
Tonks pulled a loose thread out of her sock.
What a mess, she sighed. I'm going to try to talk Greyback into having a word with Malfoy,
Remus said.
I don't know how much it'll help, but it's worth a try. Do you think that'll work?
Tonks asked doubtfully.
Malfoy sort of has it in for you. I had noticed,
Remus muttered. He gave a tense laugh and ran his hands through his hair.
Maybe you could, never mind. You can't really put it off, can you? Not initially. Possibly the day after next, but until I know what shape Matt's in. You have to go,
she said. He nodded, looking unhappy.
If only there were two of you. Maybe I could be you.
She suggested, her eyes brightening.
I had thought of that,
Remus admitted.
But I'm not asking that of you. You're already living two lives and it's too much. The alternative is you being arrested for conspiring with Sirius,
she argued.
It's not ideal, but I could manage. No,
he said gently, but with iron resolve.
What I need you to do is pretend to be revolted that I'm a werewolf and tell Malfoy that Matt and I have gone to stay at Greyback's camp for an undetermined period of time.
Tonks pursed her lips, there were so many ways that could go wrong.
When are you leaving?
She asked.
As soon as you get sick of me and go home,
he said, gesturing to the table, which had a battered suitcase leaning against it.
I've already told everyone who needs to know what's going on, but if you could keep an eye on Debbie for me. Debbie? Why?
Something clicked in her head.
Is she? You would have found out after Christmas anyway,
Remus muttered.
Yes. I've convinced her to stay for the time being, but once I can be certain that the situation at the camp is under control, then she'll join us there. If it wasn't for Malfoy's stupid investigation, it would have just looked like they followed you out of the search,
Tonks growled. Then she glanced up at Remus.
I suppose I should look for more people to help me, shouldn't I? People to help talk,
Remus reminded her.
But yes, since you're about to lose half of the team. Right,
she said, beginning a mental list of people who might be interested.
Sorry,
he said again.
It's nothing,
she said, giving him a small smile to prove she meant it.
So when do you want me to see Malfoy? I was supposed to meet him at 8 in the Leaky Cauldron,
Remus said.
If you could be there around that time, then perhaps you could explain that Matt and I have gone, and then he'll promote you and complain that I'm not there.
She nodded.
If I'm asking too much, let me know,
Remus said suddenly.
It's not too late to make other arrangements. Remus, it's fine,
she said, rolling her eyes.
I can deal with things here. You make sure that Matt's all right. Thank you,
he said weakly.
I'm sorry to have to ask this of you. Don't worry about it. If you need to contact me, Strix can find me,
he said, stretching as he stood.
Strix?
She asked.
My owl.
He reached for his suitcase and it suddenly occurred to Tonks how exhausted he looked. She wondered if he was just worried, or if the full moon was coming.
He'll be at my cottage in case Debbie needs him, and you'll be able to get in through the kitchen window, because I'm leaving that open so Strix can hunt. I know you're not averse to breaking in.
She grinned sheepishly.
You could probably just flew in, if that's easier, but... Remus.
She interrupted, rolling her eyes.
Go, before I take you myself.
He smiled and surprised her by giving her a quick hug.
I'm so sorry that it's come to this, Dora,
he said, letting her go.
And thank you so much, for everything you're doing. Remus,
she said.
Go. I'm going,
he said, shrinking his suitcase. He stuffed it into the pocket of his jeans and went to say goodbye and thank you to Mad-Eye. Once he was gone, Tonks joined Mad-Eye, who was having a fire whiskey in the kitchen. She had a cup of tea instead, and explained everything.
I thought he'd tell you eventually,
Mad-Eye muttered.
About him being a werewolf. I'm sure he's told you that I taught him during the war, not as an auror, just as a fighter.
She nodded.
There were others, too, and he refused to let them trust him until they knew. Most took it pretty well, I remember, but there were one or two who looked like they might cause trouble, at least until Potter and Black sat them down. Or Evans. That girl was formidable. Evans?
Tonks asked.
Well, Potter to everyone else, but she was Evans when I met her.
Mad Eye stiffened and reached into one of his coat pockets. His sidekick emerged and he growled the passphrase to open it.
Scrimgar,
he growled.
What do you want? I'm going to go,
Tonks whispered, as Scrimgar began to list a number of activities he had planned for the next few training sessions. Usually, she might have been intrigued enough to stay and listen, but tonight she was tired and worried for Remus and Matt.
Hang on,
Mad Eye said, and Scrimgar sighed and fell quiet.
Do you need me to take you home, Nymphadora? Don't call me that,
she muttered.
And no, thanks. I can find my way. I'll be watching for you to get there,
he said, tapping his sidekick. Damn, she thought.
All right,
she said. Mad Eye nodded at her and she slipped out of the kitchen.
Are you able to talk now?
Scrimgar asked, sounding peevish.
As a matter of fact, I am,
Mad Eye said. Tonks could almost hear Scrimgar's eye roll as she left the house and hoped that their bickering would last for a few more minutes. Hopefully, that was all she'd need. End of chapter. Chapter 34, Taking Risks.
I'm a terrible person for doing this,
Tonks muttered as she squeezed through Remus' kitchen window. The owl on the perch above the sink, Strix, presumably, ruffled its feathers and shuffled over as she toppled through. It hooted as she knocked a plate off of the dish rack. Remus really had left in a hurry if he had left it full.
Damn it!
She muttered. She had stepped on one of the shards in the dark and it had stabbed her through her sock. She fixed the plate with a muttered,
Reparo.
It was a spell she had known since she was 5 and had been using since she got her wand. Before that, she had had to steal Mum's or borrow Dad's. She put the plate back with the others and then headed toward the hallway, only to notice that her sock now felt rather sticky. She lit her wand to inspect the damage and found that she had a decent cut on the bottom of her foot. The plate had gone right through her sock. Sighing, she grew another layer of skin over her foot, vanished the blood and fixed her sock. Figuring it was stupid to put out her wand, since she'd probably walk into one of the couches or something, she left it lit. No one but her, and Strix, she supposed, was home, and there wasn't anything to gain by trying to find her way around in the dark. So much for being sneaky, she thought with a sigh. Oh well. She moved across the sitting area and into the hallway, headed for the door at the end of the corridor. Remus apparated to his usual point in Gwydir Forest. The forest itself looked as it usually did this time of year, white, with green leaves peeking out from under the snow. A dark shape, another werewolf, Remus assumed, because he could hear a beating heart and no one else would be moving around in this area at this time, emerged from the trees and came toward him. He stood perfectly still as the other person approached. There was a noisy sniff and Remus felt warm breath on his face. He could have lit his wand, but drawing a wand was something to be done with caution around the camp. Some werewolves didn't take it well. Instead, he waited for his eyes to adjust, which didn't take long, and once they had, he had reasonably good vision. Up close, the other person, a man, was recognizable. He was large and bald and only had one eye because he had lost the other one in a fight with Greyback years ago, earning him the nickname Cyclops. No one, Remus included, knew his real name, but it was a poorly kept secret that he was from a pure-blood family. Remus made a mental note to ask Sirius about pure-bloods fitting the description because Sirius had been to enough functions as a boy that he'd probably be able to identify him. Then, Remus had the depressing revelation that it was going to be a very long time before he saw either Sirius or Harry again.
Sad to be back?
Cyclops asked.
Does it show?
Remus said, wryly.
A bit,
Cyclops replied. The right side of his face was too scarred to move properly, but the left side became a grin.
How've you been, Lupin? Not too bad,
Remus said politely.
You? The same,
he said, shrugging. Remus smiled.
May I? Better you than me. I'll see you in a month or two, I suppose.
Cyclops never actually ventured into the camp. He was one of 5 sentries and the only one to patrol full-time. He slept in strange little shelters he had built in or under trees and either hunted or foraged for his own food or had it brought to him by one of the women in the pack.
I'll visit, I'm sure,
Remus said.
I always seem to.
He could only take so much of the main building. Last time they had been here, he and Matt had borrowed one of Cyclops' shelters for a few nights, after being unable to spend another moment in the main building. Cyclops smiled and waved him on his way. Remus carefully picked his way through the trees, relying on his sense of smell more than his eyes because the forest looked the same. About a minute after leaving Cyclops, Remus started to see the first cottages and another minute after that, the main building appeared out of the night. It was a monstrous, rectangular building, at least 10 times the size of Remus' cottage, probably more, but despite that, there was only a single, small door. The werewolf guarding it, an older woman that Remus had seen before but never met, looked up as he approached, sniffed, and then nodded and let him pass. Remus turned the doorknob and stepped inside. He patted his pocket to ensure his suitcase was still there, but it was probably too late to go back even if it wasn't. The door opened into a large hall. 4 long tables with benches, like those in the Great Hall at Hogwarts, only these had people of all ages sitting in them and not just students, took up most of the floor, but the middle 2 benches had been shortened to make room for an enormous, throne-like chair. In that chair sat Greyback, whose head snapped up as Remus walked in.
Remus,
he said, baring his teeth in a very poor imitation of a smile.
I've been expecting you for hours now. Sorry to keep you waiting, Fenrir,
Remus said. Some of the people at the tables started whispering, most of them called Greyback sir or father. Fenrir probably seemed disrespectful compared to that. Remus was glad, he didn't want anyone mistaking it for familiarity instead of simple rudeness.
My departure wasn't expected, so I had a few things that needed to be sorted out first, as you can doubtless appreciate. Of course,
Greyback said.
I'm nothing if not understanding. Of course,
Remus said, arching an eyebrow. He opened his mouth to ask where Matt was, he couldn't see him amongst the people at the tables, and then thought better of asking in front of an audience.
Your room's ready for you, just so you know,
Greyback continued, sweeping a hand over to the left side of the room. There were no walls inside the main building, there were only a continuous line of doorways, so close together that the right side frame of one was the left side frame of the one next to it. Through them, were partially visible bedrooms. While each room only appeared to be a few feet wide and a few feet deep, they had been magically enlarged so that even the smallest bedroom had a bed, dresser, table, and a small bathroom containing a shower, toilet and sink. Each doorway had a small, numbered plaque above it. Remus was 37 because he was the 37th person that Greyback had bitten.
Why don't you put your things away and join the rest of us?
Greyback said. Remus knew when to be rude and when to do what he was told. This was a time to listen. The people at the tables watched him as he walked to his room and continued to watch, through the doorway, when he was inside. He pulled his suitcase out of his pocket, resized it and put it on one of the 2 chairs he had at his little table. He wished, fervently, for a door, but knew that was never going to happen. Once, years ago, he had pointed out that privacy was a basic human right, and Greyback had countered, not entirely incorrectly, that they weren't actually human, and then had wanted to know what it was Remus was trying to hide from his pack. Remus hadn't breached the subject since and was still doorless. Even the bathroom lacked a door, there was a curtain instead. Remus took one last, resigned look at the room before returning to the hall.
All settled in?
Greyback asked. No. Remus nodded.
It's been a long time since you were here,
Greyback said.
How about a tour to help you get your bearings again?
It wasn't a question, so Remus shrugged. He waited for Greyback to call one of his children over, but Greyback himself stood and stretched, drawing everyone's attention. Several even stood, as if to protect him.
We won't be long,
Greyback assured them all.
Come, Remus.
Remus followed him out through the single door and into the snowy night. Greyback made straight for the trees and kept walking until they were out past the boundaries of the camp. They had passed one of the sentries on the way. Remus looked around to see if Matt was being kept on the outskirts as some sort of punishment, but couldn't see anything to suggest that that was true.
Now,
Greyback said in a very nasty voice.
We need to talk. About?
Remus asked, leaning back against a tree.
You and your little pets,
he snapped.
You've got two now, that I know of, and I don't like it. The rosier boy was supposed to be mine. I don't claim ownership,
Remus said, folding his arms.
But you have it.
Greyback shoved him. Remus winced as a knobbly piece of bark poked him in the back and made a show of smoothing his jumper because he knew it would annoy Greyback.
I had to go and find Debbie, although I'm sure you already know that, instead of having her seek me out. You're interrupting the natural process. So I wasn't supposed to help her adjust.
Greyback opened his mouth and closed it.
And how was a muggle supposed to find you?
Greyback gave him a stony look.
And, I thought you liked it when your Vic,
Greyback swelled at the word.
Gifted lived through their first full moon.
Greyback's face twisted.
Without my help, Debbie wouldn't have,
Remus said tersely.
She tore herself to pieces on her first night and I had to use every bit of healing knowledge I possess to save her in the morning. She should have been here. Perhaps,
Remus said neutrally.
But she wasn't. You, on the other hand, were. Why weren't you with her? Surely, as the father, you owed it to your newest child to be there when she needed you the most. I had the rest of the pack. None of whom were in any danger without you here,
Remus said flatly.
If Debbie looks to me for guidance, instead of you, then it's probably because I did guide her. You didn't, but you could have. That's your problem, not mine, as far as I'm concerned.
Greyback's hand was around Remus' throat in an instant. Remus could see a long scar on the back of his hand and wondered if that was there from when Dora had saved Matt. He hoped so.
I am your alpha. Then why should it matter if people follow me?
Remus asked politely.
I follow you, don't I? Do you?
Greyback snarled.
Is my undying loyalty not a pair?
Remus said sarcastically, but was cut off by increased pressure on his throat.
Things are going to change,
Greyback growled.
I've put up with your rubbish for years and my patience has run out. You'll call me sir or father, just like your brothers and sisters do. You'll do what I say, when I say, and you won't challenge it. And if I do? You're only useful to me if you're loyal to me,
Greyback said in the same nasty voice he had used earlier.
If you're not, then you're just taking up space and being a bad influence for your brothers and sisters.
He squeezed until Remus couldn't breathe. Remus, who had had enough, pulled his wand out of his pocket and thought, "Depple so." Greyback soared off him and landed in a pile of snow. He was back on his feet in an instant, but didn't come any closer. He stared warily at Remus' wand, which was still out. He either didn't have his own with him, or wasn't confident about being better or faster in a duel than Remus was.
"Why don't you stop with the threats and strangulation and just tell me what you want?"
Remus said, leaning back against the tree. Greyback looked murderous but said,
"You're threatening my leadership. You think I want to challenge you?"
Remus asked, incredulously. Greyback snarled.
"I assure you I don't. You've collected 2 of my pack. And collecting them, as you so distastefully put it, took me 8 years,
Remus pointed out.
I have no intention of trying to challenge you, but if I did, it would take me another 80 years to have enough people to make it worth the effort. And in another 80 years, it's highly probable that you'll be dead and I'll be too old to care. So you've thought about it?"
Greyback snarled.
"Of course I have,"
Remus said.
"It's no secret that I don't approve of what you're doing here, Greyback. I considered overthrowing you in the Christmas of 1981.
That had been a dark time in Remus' life.
I was going to kill you and then come and live out here so that I could dedicate my otherwise meaningless life to the rehabilitation of the children you bite."
Greyback smelled furious. Remus didn't entirely blame him, he had just admitted to wanting to murder him.
"Then, of course,"
Remus continued,
"I had some sense smacked into me, both figuratively and literally."
McGonagall had slapped him for thinking such a thing, and then held him while he choked out all of his half-formed plans to rule the pack, or break into Azkaban and kill Sirius himself, or learn necromancy so that he could bring Lily and James and Peter back, or steal Harry back from his aunt and uncle. She and Dumbledore had talked some sense back into him and he had snapped out of his grief-prompted madness.
"I have not had any intention of overthrowing you since then, I promise."
And that was true. As much as he thought most of Greyback's victims would be better off away from the camp and Greyback, he knew they'd struggle. Most of them had been raised by Greyback, and the older werewolves in a pack environment. They'd have no idea how to live in the real world, and while a large part of Remus wanted to help anyway, he knew, realistically, that he didn't have the space, time, or money to help them all. They'd end up a lot worse off than they were now if he tried. Greyback, of course, wouldn't like that sort of logic, so Remus couldn't say it.
"I'll take your word for it,"
Greyback spat, still seething.
"But if you put as much as a paw out of line, if you challenge me once, or do something I don't like, then I'll destroy you, and your little pets."
He bared his teeth.
"You got that?" "I've got it, yes,"
Remus said with a shiver that was only partially due to the cold.
"Can I see Matt, now?" "Of course,"
Greyback said, his teeth still glinting in the dark.
"Any suspicious behavior, remember. I won't hesitate. Can't afford to." "I heard you the first time,"
Remus said, pocketing his wand. He approached Greyback slowly but Greyback let him pass.
"And I think it's safe to say that there's nothing suspicious about concern for my friend. So, Matt."
It was Harry and Padfoot's third trip to Wolples. They had been once, earlier in the week, to pick up a book that might help them destroy the Horcrux. Unfortunately, it hadn't, and Padfoot had tried everything and so they were back again.
"The object with you?"
Kira asked.
"No,"
Padfoot sighed.
"I just need I can't help you much if all you tell me is beyond magical repair,
she said, throwing her hands up in the air. Harry didn't think she was truly angry, he thought she was enjoying the challenge, but she was certainly frustrated.
At least tell me what it is. We can't,
Harry said, drawing her dark gaze.
And why not?
She asked coolly.
Look,
Padfoot said, tersely,
we just need to know how to damage something so badly that no amount of help, muggle or magical, can fix it.
Then he seemed to realize he was being abrupt and grinned.
Is that so hard?
Yes, Kira said.
It was never mind.
She didn't have much of a sense of humor, Harry was beginning to notice. It seemed Padfoot had noticed too.
Can you think of any books that might help us with that?
Personally, Harry thought they should just go with Remus' idea, which was to let him bite it on a full moon. There was no cure for lycanthropy. Padfoot, though, and also Remus to a degree, had wanted to look for a less unpredictable solution, since there had been no studies on the effects of a werewolf bite on non-living objects. When they had mentioned that, Harry had immediately imagined the locket sprouting fur and fangs and trying to bite them all, and that had made him wary, but impatience was soothing that worry. Padfoot also, for some reason, wanted a solution that would allow Harry to destroy the Horcrux. Kira was silent for a moment and then glided over to a shelf. Irreversible incantations and everlasting enchantments were in her skeletal hand when she returned.
Something like these?
She asked, offering them a book each. Padfoot flicked through everlasting enchantments and then passed it back and shook his head.
We need something destructive, not a permanent anti-rust charm, or a spell that ties a knot that can't be undone. If you would just tell me what,
Kira said, and then cut off as another customer entered the shop. Madame Walpole shuffled over to the woman, who was tall and blonde, and Kira lowered her voice before continuing.
If you could just tell me what you're looking for, then I could be more helpful. It's dark,
Padfoot whispered back.
A very evil object that we want to get rid of. That's as much as I can tell you. Is it an object, or is it living?
Kira asked, brushing her long hair over one shoulder. Harry exchanged a look with Padfoot. Padfoot still had dark hair and grey eyes, but he was wearing a pair of rectangular glasses, his eyebrows were thicker than usual and his hair stuck up a bit like Harry's, though not nearly as badly, instead of being shaggy, like usual. He also had a mustache. It was still Padfoot, though, and they were able to communicate wordlessly almost as easily as usual.
Hard to say,
Harry said finally.
It either is or it isn't,
Kira said. Harry and Padfoot exchanged another look. Then she sighed.
Magically irreparable. Dark magic, and I mean dark, not a cutting charm or the Imperious Curse, could work. Otherwise, some sort of magical creature is probably your best chance. Dragon's fire might do it, or a basilisk's venom, or perhaps a werewolf bite, although none of those are things you would have access to.
You would be surprised, Harry thought, hiding a smile. Padfoot still looked uncertain. Kira's eyes widened slightly.
I've just thought of something. Does your mysterious object have ears? What? No.
Padfoot said, while Harry said a quiet but firm, yes.
Which is it?
Kira asked, frowning.
Yes,
Harry said. Padfoot had never spoken to the locket, but Harry had. He wouldn't forget that in a hurry.
It doesn't have ears,
Padfoot muttered.
No, but it can hear,
Harry argued.
Then perhaps I could help you,
Kira said, with a somewhat predatory smile.
Or one of those awful plants. Mandrakes, they're called. Awful? They're supposed to be useful,
Padfoot said, frowning.
Oh very,
Kira said, suddenly looked menacing.
For killing banshees. If you want one of those, then I will not help you.
Her expression lightened somewhat.
If you want my help, however, that could be arranged.
Her usual, small smile made an appearance.
You would? What, scream at it?
Padfoot asked, and then chuckled.
If it would help,
she said, shrugging.
Excuse me,
a soft voice said. Harry moved out of the way of the blonde woman that had entered earlier. She cleared her throat and Padfoot, who had been staring at her, jumped.
Sorry, miss. Sorry,
he said, moving to stand beside Harry and Kira. She gave him a cool look and pulled down 2 books titled Sword and Sorting Hat, and Golden Children. She gave them all a haughty look. Harry supposed it wasn't underserved, since Padfoot was gawking at her and both he and Kira were staring at her, trying to work out what it was about her that had worried Padfoot, and made her way back to the counter.
She's my cousin,
Padfoot whispered, once she was out of earshot.
Narcissa. Married to Malfoy,
he added, with a significant look at Harry. Harry pulled a face.
So?
Kira asked impatiently.
Will you require my help? I don't know,
Padfoot said slowly.
We might have to open it first, and it's only opened once. Maybe if we lock you in a room with it again, kiddo,
he added, nudging Harry,
then we've got half a chance. How would we keep it open, though?
Harry asked.
It closed on its own, last time, and we couldn't be there while you were with it, Kira. It seems you have some things to work out first,
she said, smiling.
But know that you may accept my offer at any time.
Thanks, Harry said. Padfoot nodded.
Is there anything else I can help you with?
She asked, cocking her head to her side.
Yes,
Padfoot said.
I've got a friend who's in grave need of reading material.
Kira smiled again.
Did you have anything in mind?
A few hags leered at her, but Narcissa's glare kept them from coming any closer. Her face was usually enough to keep them away. Everyone in Nocturne Alley knew who she was and not to bother her, but she had changed her face and robes the moment she left Walpole's. She was now short, with red hair, brown eyes, and as many freckles as there were Weasleys. She knew it was Sirius in the bookshop, and that the man he was with was probably Harry Potter in disguise. She hadn't recognized Sirius by sight, but the moment he had laughed that bark-like laugh, she had known he was her cousin, and while they had never been close, they had spent a lot of time together at family events, and then, once they were older, at school. She wondered what it was they had been discussing so intently with the Banshee. Sirius always had attracted the strangest friends, first Lupin, then the mudblood that married Potter, and now this woman. Sirius and the Potter boy left 5 minutes after she did. Sirius had a bulky package tucked under one arm and was talking in a low voice to the Potter boy. Narcissa, unfortunately, couldn't hear what was being said, but the Potter boy smiled and nodded. She walked after them, at a distance, content to watch. This time, Lucius would probably be furious. In fact, he would be beyond furious, considering he was currently having a meeting about his search with Lupin in the Leaky Cauldron, but that was too bad. Narcissa had her own agenda this morning. The pair ducked into a dim side street and Narcissa waited for the sound of apparition, but none came. Sirius emerged again, but the man he had been with was gone. In his place was a blond boy, with eyes the same green as Evan's had been. Narcissa had been horribly jealous of the Mudblood's eyes all through her schooling. Yes, she thought, watching as he hurried after Sirius. It's definitely the Potter boy. Sirius and Potter left Nocturne Alley and she left after them, curious. She was curious about Sirius, who, though he wasn't wearing his own face, looked remarkably healthy and cheerful for a man who had only been out of Azkaban for 10 months. She was slightly more interested in Potter, however. There were so many rumors surrounding him that she wanted the chance to see whether they were true or not. She knew, after 5 minutes of following him, that Severus had been correct. He was no Dark Lord. Dark Lords didn't chat happily with their godfathers, or laugh or smile as much as he did. And, while Potter seemed comfortable around magic and had a wand sticking out of his back pocket, he didn't seem overly powerful. Certainly not powerful enough to have destroyed the Dark Lord as a baby. She did notice that he was reasonably mature. Grudgingly, she had to admit that he was more mature than either of her children. When he and Sirius went to the apothecary, he took charge and directed Sirius to various displays but wasn't bossy about it the way Hydrus and Draco would have been. The ingredients were none that went together in any potion that she recognized, but then, she had always been terrible at potions. He had also paid for everything they bought there, which she thought was odd. Perhaps Sirius didn't have any money. She had assumed he would have had access to the Black Vault, but maybe they were using James Potter's vault instead. After the visit to the apothecary, they made a quick trip to the magical menagerie. They bought owl treats and she followed them in under the pretense of buying treats for the boys' rats. She lost them outside, sadly, and took a guess about which direction they might have gone. It turned out to be a very good one. She spotted Sirius again, waiting outside a small Honeyduke's shop which only sold chocolate. The Honeyduke's sweets weren't quite as popular in Diagon Alley due to competition from Sugarplum's sweets. Potter, however, was nowhere in sight. Narcissa hesitated for a moment and then slipped past Sirius and into the shop. It was busy. Christmas was only a few days away, so people were buying last-minute presents, but it was a small shop and there were only 2 blondes in the room. One was an older man and the other was Potter. He was clutching several slabs of chocolate and sampling some of the squares the store offered in little bowls on the shelves. It occurred to her suddenly how easy it would be to simply reach out and take him. Before he could even protest, they'd be far away and there was very little anyone would be able to do about it, Potter or Sirius included. She and Lucius could raise Potter as their own, claim he was a relative of hers, and ensure he got into Slytherin. Draco wouldn't need to spy, and if or when the Dark Lord returned, he could decide whether he wanted Potter dead, or serving him. But what if the Dark Lord did want him dead? She and the boys, and possibly even Lucius, would grow attached to him. Could they sentence him to death, just like that? Would they risk their own lives for him, or try to protect him? Would the Dark Lord then brand them as traitors and kill them too? Or would the Ministry find him with them, and convict her and Lucius for helping Sirius? Would Sirius find him first, as he had at St. Mungo's, and steal him back? And, would he be content with just having Potter back again, or would he take revenge on them? Or, should she just leave him to Sirius? Just let him become a Gryffindor, as Severus predicted, and have Draco join him there? Should she let Draco lose all of his old friends, and possibly even his brother upon his arrival at Hogwarts in order to befriend Harry Potter? He had gained some useful skills from Severus, but was the cost worth it? Draco would learn to lie and spy and shield his thoughts. She'd never know if he was being honest with her or not. She'd never be completely sure which side he had picked. She'd lose him to the Dark Lord, or she'd lose him to Harry Potter. She had accepted that as a possibility, even if Lucius hadn't. That was why she had asked for Severus' help in the first place, so that if he did befriend Potter, Draco would be able to hide it. But was that worth?
"Oops,"
said a young voice. Potter was holding 2 festively wrapped packages, presumably the chocolate, and was staring up at her apologetically.
"Sorry." "It's all right,"
she said coolly, brushing off her robes. Potter looked so guilty that she gave in and offered him a very small smile. He offered her a shy smile in return and said a polite goodbye. Again, she was grudgingly forced to admit that he was a lot kinder than her sons would have been. He dodged her and ran out to rejoin Sirius, who ruffled his hair and took the packages with an expression of distaste. It was an expression she knew, even on the unfamiliar face. It was the same one that Sirius had worn permanently through functions, and when he had been presented with a plate of fairy egg olives. She wondered when he had stopped liking chocolate. Potter laughed, presumably at the expression on Sirius' face, and, as she watched through the shop window, continued to smile as he and Sirius set off down the street again. She watched Potter's smile with longing. Her sons wore similar expressions, but none were quite the same. They smirked, or smiled, but they never grinned. They never looked so relaxed or happy for the sake of being happy. It was something she had been told never to do, because it wasn't proper, and it was the same thing that she and Lucius had told Hydrus and Draco. But it was the way Sirius had looked with his friends as a child, and the way Andy had looked with Ted, carefree and happy. She wanted that for Draco, and her chest warmed a little. It was worth it. Harry Potter would be in Gryffindor and so would Draco. And then, with the skills that he had learned from Severus, Draco would have the ability to pick his own side and conceal the truth from the side he didn't pick. And he could be happy. Harry Potter was lying to the rest of the world by going out in disguise, but he seemed happy enough, because he would have made the choice for himself. Lucius and Hydrus would believe Draco was a Gryffindor who served the Dark Lord, and that was all. If Draco sided with Potter, they'd never know. She hadn't told either of them about Draco's lessons with Severus, and neither had Draco or Severus, so they wouldn't know that he could lie well. She'd know better, but if Draco was happy, then she could deal with whichever side he picked. Besides, by the time Draco had to make a decision, he'd have enough of Severus' skills that he'd be able to look her in the face and lie. She wouldn't know any more or less than he told her, and, while she had never believed it herself, she had been told that ignorance was bliss. Just this once, she hoped it could be.
"Can I help you, madam?"
a witch with the Honeyduke's emblem on her robes asked.
"Oh,"
Narcissa said.
"Yes, thank you."
She chose 2 blocks of chocolate, one with silver wrapping, one with gold wrapping, and a large block of Honeyduke's finest. Then, as an afterthought, she also selected a small box of assorted chocolates.
"These."
She paid, and the witch wrapped them for her and waved her from the shop. On her way to meet Lucius, who was probably waiting for her, she spied Sirius and Potter again, reading the price sign at Fortescue's. She hesitated for a moment, and then reversed the charms on her appearance. One little girl gaped at her and tugged on her mother's sleeve, but no one else had noticed. She strode directly up behind Potter and Sirius and cleared her throat. Potter looked up curiously, while Sirius turned around slowly. She knew he must have recognized her, but he didn't show it.
"Can I help you?"
he asked, frowning slightly.
"I assume you're the boy's guardian?"
she asked. Sirius inclined his head.
"I suggest you keep him closer. Letting him go alone into shops is risky. Anyone could take him."
"I nearly did."
"I see,"
Sirius said.
"Was that all?" "Yes."
She turned and started to walk away, but then she stopped and called over her shoulder.
With Black still loose, no child's safe. I'd hate to see him taken.
She waited for a witty retort, as much as she had loathed it, because they were usually directed at her. She had always admired Sirius' quick wit. When none was forthcoming, she turned around completely to see if he had even heard her, but they had vanished. She smiled, pleased to have rattled him. It wasn't something she had ever been particularly good at. Bella had been much better. She was also impressed that he had taken the warning. It seemed he had matured in Azkaban, or maybe it had been taking Potter that had done it. Once, he might have taken the risk of staying. She still had a small smile on her face when she met Lucius, who was looking irritated.
"Where have you been?"
he asked. She raised an eyebrow.
"Hello to you too,"
she said. Lucius glowered at her. Narcissa waited.
"Sorry,"
Lucius said finally, and kissed her forehead. He gestured to the packages in her arms.
"What have you bought?" "Books and rat treats. And chocolate,"
she said.
"One for the boys and one for Bella." "You have 4 Honeydukes packages,"
Lucius noted.
"I thought maybe I'd send something to Andy this year,"
she said quietly.
"To the blood trader?"
Lucius asked, looking puzzled.
"Blood trader seems to be a lesser crime now that we're turning our son into one,"
she said pointedly.
"To me, at least."
Lucius still looked blank.
"How was your meeting?" "Productive,"
he admitted.
"Lupin was about as tolerable as it's possible for someone like him to be, and I've got the details of each of his searchers so that I can arrange meetings with them. Here, let me."
Lucius shrank the parcels and tucked them into a pocket of his robes. Then, he offered her his arm, which she took, and they set off down the busy street.
"What else did you do this morning?" "I saw Sirius and the Potter boy," she said.
Lucius stopped.
"You what?"
Narcissa tugged on his elbow to keep him walking.
"Where are they? Why didn't you fetch me?" "They left," she said, shrugging. "And I didn't fetch you because if I'd wanted to capture them, I'd have been able to do so alone."
Or maybe not. Sirius had always been talented with a wand, but then, he had always had a habit of underestimating her.
"You didn't,"
Lucius shook his head.
"Narcissa, you aren't making sense. Why wouldn't you want them caught?" "I was watching them," she said. "Watching? You could have watched them when they were your prisoners. How could you just let them walk free?"
he hissed, stopping again. She knew he wouldn't understand her reasons, so she just let him rant.
"Has it escaped your attention that it's our money funding the search? What would people say if they heard about?" "Frankly, Lucius, if you're stupid enough to tell anyone, then you deserve whatever people would say about you," she said.
He just stared at her.
"Now, did you want to get Hydras, the black robes or the emerald ones?"
End of chapter. Chapter 35, A Delicate Balance.
Gobstone, Pawn, Merlin Chocolate Frog Card End.
Draco hesitated.
"A rock. Is that a question or a statement?"
Severus asked.
"Statement,"
Draco asked.
"It is a bezoar,"
Severus corrected.
"But better. We'll use 10 objects next time."
Draco's face scrunched up, as if he was calling Severus rude names in his head.
"Is that a problem?" "No, sir,"
he muttered.
"Are you aware that you blink when you lie?"
Severus asked, arching an eyebrow.
"It wasn't a lie,"
Draco muttered, very obviously trying not to blink this time. Severus didn't call him out on it, however. The more he practiced lying without blinking, the more natural it would become. As long as he didn't stop blinking altogether when he lied, that would be just as telling. Draco fidgeted. Severus imagined him fighting the urge to speak his mind, as he was being encouraged to do these days, and stay quiet, as he had been raised to do his entire life.
"What's the point of all of this?"
Draco demanded, unable to stay quiet anymore.
"We're spending time together,"
Severus told him. He felt as excited about it as Draco looked.
"Why?"
Draco asked, folding his arms.
"That's what godfathers do, apparently,"
Severus sneered, thinking of Black. Draco glared at him.
"Say it, Draco."
Draco got a strangely thoughtful look on his face, which darkened to a scowl.
"We never used to," he said. "You are at a critical stage in your development,"
Severus said.
"You have a lot to gain from my presence." "Like what?"
Draco asked sulkily.
"The only skills you've got are to do with potions, but you don't teach me any of that. All we do is play stupid memory games. If you cannot remember 5 objects after 10 seconds of looking at them, then how do you hope to follow potions instructions?"
Severus asked. Draco didn't say anything.
"I set the activities,"
Severus said in a tone of finality.
"If I want to play stupid memory games, then that is what we'll do. Can I at least bring Roquefort next time?"
Draco asked.
"The only rats I allow in my quarters are dead ones for potions,"
Severus said flatly. Which was true, but he might have made an exception if he could be sure that it was Hydrus who had Pettigrew. He wasn't sure which boy had the real rat, and which had the man in disguise. The only ones who did were Pettigrew himself, Lucius and possibly Narcissa. There was no way that he'd risk letting Pettigrew into one of his and Draco's sessions.
"Fine, he'll stay home,"
Draco huffed, folding his arms.
"Good,"
Severus said.
"IW."
Crack. Draco started and fell off his chair, while Severus hid his shock behind a calm mask. He also hid his irritation. He didn't like the fact that Lucius' house elf could access his quarters at any time.
"Young Master Draco,"
the thing squeaked, bowing deeply.
"Professor Severus, sir. Dobby is being sent by Mistress to fetch his young master. Mistress is needing him to be ready for tonight, sir,"
he added, looking at Severus with enormous green eyes.
"Go,"
Severus told Draco, who looked torn between his forming loathing of time with Snape and the fact that it was Dobby who was offering him his escape. Dobby offered his thin arm and Draco took it. The pair vanished and Severus leaned back in his chair and sighed. Lupin. You've had time to settle into the new search and so, as discussed yesterday, I have recorded the names of those involved in the magical search and the dates you are to investigate each of them. Do something similar with those in your search party and send it to me as soon as possible. Lucius Malfoy.
"What?"
Remus said aloud. The owl who had delivered it gave him a haughty look and flew off. Matt glanced over, looking puzzled, and Remus shook his head. Matt went back to the card game he was playing with Greentooth, a 12-year-old muggle girl who, in a fit of Dora-like stubbornness, refused to respond to Sarah, her real name. She had supposedly developed an infatuation with Matt, though both Remus and Matt were reasonably sure she was spying on them for Greyback. She didn't know that they knew, however, which was entertaining on one level, but was still more irritating than anything else. Remus read and reread the letter, but it still didn't make any sense. He and Malfoy hadn't spoken for almost a week, and he certainly hadn't been searching since then. So Malfoy's made a mistake. Pretty big mistake to make, though. Maybe the letter wasn't meant for me, although it's addressed to me. He frowned thoughtfully. But there wasn't an address on the envelope, just my name. Which means I was definitely supposed to get it. But he should also know that I'm away. And in this, it doesn't sound like he does. Dora was supposed to have told him, but perhaps she hadn't. That wouldn't explain the letter, but it would be a start. He stood, and Greentooth's head immediately snapped up.
"Where are you going?"
she asked.
"Out,"
Remus said, catching Greyback's eye. He was lounging in his throne. He, too, had looked over as soon as Remus stood and was watching with a frown.
"Where? Can I come?"
Greentooth asked, looking eager.
"Maybe next time,"
Remus said. He held Greyback's gaze until Greyback nodded and tapped his wrist. Remus understood. He could go, but there'd be trouble if he was out for too long.
"You didn't say where,"
Greentooth whined.
"Got any rope?"
Matt asked. He had formed half-serious plans to tie Greentooth to a tree somewhere and leave her there. Remus was ashamed to admit that the idea was getting more and more tempting.
"No,"
Remus said, answering both of them at once. Matt and Greentooth assumed unnervingly similar, disappointed expressions.
"Will you be all right?"
he asked Matt. Matt shrugged and nodded. Remus said goodbye to Matt, and to Greentooth too, he supposed, and left the main building. Greyback's eyes were on him the whole time. Outside, he was forced to explain himself to Bluefoot and Silverear, members of Greentooth's pack, who had named themselves after colored body parts in Greyback's honor, and was forced to endure several minutes of questions as they walked him to the camp border. Silverear was easily the smartest of the two, but he was also the youngest, only 10 compared to Bluefoot's 14. Remus, who had years of experience deflecting conversation, was able to avoid answering most of their questions with very little effort. And, by avoiding questions, he wasn't lying and so didn't have to worry about his scent giving him away. They left him at the border, with specific instructions to check in with them as soon as he returned. Remus thanked them, a little sarcastically, and disapparated before they could tell him anything else. Home was his first stop. He intended to collect Strix and write to Matt so that he could arrange a meeting with Dora. That was an easier way of doing it than wandering around London and hoping to bump into her. As he walked in the front door, however, it became immediately apparent that he needn't bother. He could smell her in his sitting room, and hear movement in the hallway. He closed the door, and reveled in the luxury of such a simple act, and considered going to say hello, but decided it would be easier to let her come to him. Her rucksack was resting on his table, which meant she'd have to return to this part of the cottage. Remus had only just made himself comfortable. The softness of a couch was another thing he had missed, when footsteps announced her return. She didn't even see him until she was a few feet away. Remus had plenty of time to observe her, however. Her hair was a deep blue color and she was wearing a pair of jeans and what appeared to be one of his old jumpers. In her arms was almost every article of clothing he owned, minus the things he had taken to the camp. When she did spot him, she shrieked and dropped everything, and her hair turned a blinding white.
"Good afternoon,"
he said, giving her a bemused smile and a nod.
"Remus!"
she exclaimed. Her hair turned lime green, which Remus guessed was a mix of happiness and something, which, going by her scent, he thought might have been guilt.
You scared me. What are you doing here?
She hugged him and sat down.
Is Matt okay?
She asked.
What happened to your face? In reverse order,
he said.
Greyback is responsible for this.
He gestured to his black eye and the cut on his jaw.
But it was probably my fault for provoking him.
Remus had spent a lot of time in the past week pushing the boundaries Greyback had given him so that he'd know what was acceptable and what wasn't. It probably wasn't overly intelligent of him, but it was useful information, and worth the painful warning Greyback had given him.
Matt's as good as he could be, given the circumstances, and as for what I'm doing here, I'm more interested to know why you're here, although I suspect it has something to do with the strange letter I received this morning. Letter?
She asked.
From Malfoy,
he explained.
He wanted to follow up on yesterday's discussion.
He wasn't surprised at all to see that she seemed to know what he was talking about.
Which I found puzzling because I didn't see Malfoy yesterday. That's odd,
she said, very unconvincingly.
Dora,
he said, and she winced. Her hair was now more green than yellow.
Care to explain? Not particularly,
she admitted, and Remus smiled slightly. She sighed and fiddled with a loose thread in the jumper.
I've been pretending to be you,
she said, staring at her lap.
I had figured that much out,
he said wryly.
And Matt,
she added in a small voice. That, he hadn't known.
Dora,
he started.
It was my choice,
she said defensively.
Thank you,
he said. She blinked and her hair flashed white and then orange.
You're not angry. Angry?
He laughed.
You're doing me and a very good friend of mine an enormous favor of your own accord. I'd be stupid to be anything other than grateful.
He grinned.
Even if you are stealing my clothes.
She hugged herself. Actually, Remus realized, she hugged the jumper she was wearing. It was a bright red knitted one that Aunt Catherine had sent him for his 17th birthday. He had worn it once for the sake of it, James had forced him to, thinking it was funny, and Remus supposed it had been, and once to the Quidditch final in his 7th year, house pride and all that. Though it was actually very comfortable, he hadn't worn it since, partially because it was too bright to suit his tastes, and partially to spite Aunt Catherine.
Borrowing your clothes,
she corrected.
Besides, if I'm you, then they're actually mine. I do hope you haven't been wearing that while you've been me,
he said, nodding at the jumper.
Twice,
she said, and Remus pulled a face.
What? It's nice. It's yours,
he said.
As long as you never wear it again while you're being me. Done,
she said, beaming, and then gave him a wary look.
Are you sure you're not angry? Positive,
he said.
I'm worried that you might be overworking yourself. I can handle it,
she assured him. He stared at her face for a moment, trying to see if there were any dark circles forming, or if her eyes were sleepy, but gave up. She was perfectly capable of hiding anything like that.
So how long are you back? A few hours, maybe,
Remus said, thinking that, since he was already away from the camp, he might as well go and visit Sirius and Harry.
Why? Have you had lunch? No,
he said. She bounced to her feet.
Brilliant,
she said. She flicked her wand at the dropped pile of clothes and they soared into her rucksack.
Let's go then, I'm paying. Are you sure?
He asked, standing.
Let me put it this way,
she said, hauling her rucksack on.
I'm going to ask you lots of questions about being you and about Matt, because now that you know, it's not strange for me to ask you these things.
Remus laughed.
And I can either reward you for your participation, or you can pay for your own lunch and help me anyway.
She gave him a winning smile.
You know I'd help you anyway,
he said.
I know. Which is why I insist on paying. And,
she added,
if you insist on paying for your own, I'll insist on paying for mine. With sickles.
Remus couldn't help grimacing.
I'm so sorry about that, by the way. I didn't know back then, but I was thinking about it the other day and felt terrible. Oh. That's another reason for me to pay, I'm making it up to you.
Her cheerful mood was infectious and so different to the grim intensity of the camp. Remus found himself grinning and offering her the pot of flu powder.
Someone's in the house,
Padfoot whispered. Harry froze and several of the nightshade berries he was holding slipped out of his hands. They dropped onto the floor and rolled away, but Harry didn't really mind. He wiped his hands on his robes and drew his wand.
Who?
He breathed. Padfoot rolled his eyes.
If I knew, I'd have said,
he muttered, and the corner of his mouth twitched. He didn't smile though, he looked tense and worried, and Wad dropped the small hand trowel he had been using in favor of his wand. Harry stared at it and tightened his grip on his own wand. He swallowed and glanced at Padfoot. They both rose as quietly as possible. Harry was careful not to disturb his cauldron, or Padfoot's pot of soil.
Are they upstairs?
Padfoot shook his head.
I heard the flow,
he whispered.
Could it be Mooney?
Harry asked hopefully, he had missed him.
It could,
Padfoot said, nodding,
but he's supposed to be at the camp. Not to say he can't leave, of course, but I'd have expected him to write. Padfoot? Harry.
It was Mooney, or at least it sounded like him. Harry relaxed and lowered his wand. Padfoot grinned briefly, but kept his up.
We're up here.
Padfoot called, and then Harry could hear his footsteps too. Mooney strolled in, wearing a broad smile, but Harry noticed that he had a blackened eye and a cut on his face.
What happened?
Harry asked, stepping towards him. Padfoot, however, caught his shoulder. Mooney's smile faltered.
What did you go as on Halloween?
He asked.
A pirate,
Mooney said at once, smiling again. Harry shrugged Padfoot's hand off and ran to hug Mooney. Mooney hugged him back.
And it was Greyback,
he said, answering Harry's question.
You wouldn't believe how much I've missed the two of you,
he said.
Even if the Mad Eye-style welcome is all I get. I was just making sure,
Padfoot said, shooing Harry away so that he could hug Mooney too. Harry started collecting the nightshade berries he had dropped.
Constant vigilance?
Mooney asked, grinning.
Something like that,
Padfoot agreed, as he flopped back down. Mooney sat with a little more decorum.
It's probably not a bad idea,
Mooney said thoughtfully.
I've just come from lunch with Dora and you wouldn't believe what she's been up to.
It turned out that Dora, who Harry had heard a reasonable amount about from Mooney, had been pretending to be Mooney to keep Malfoy from getting suspicious about Mooney's absence. Padfoot could believe this, and found it extremely funny, as did Harry, but also a little worrying.
We'll have to establish safety questions,
he said thoughtfully.
Can't have us wandering up to her in Diagon Alley, thinking she's you. Firstly,
Mooney said,
when are you ever in Diagon Alley?
Padfoot opened his mouth.
And secondly, if you did go, it's more than likely that I'd be there with the two of you.
Though Harry thought Mooney was making a very good point, Padfoot still asked him several questions that could apparently be used to identify him later.
What are you working on, Harry?
Mooney asked, refusing to answer Padfoot's last question.
Where did you hide your chocolate at the end of 7th year?
Harry, who had managed to find every berry and was now attempting to weigh them on a set of old scales, looked up.
My form revealer,
he said, dropping a handful in.
Well, my second one, I messed the first one up. Mooney,
Padfoot whined.
A hollowed-out copy of Decoding the Solar System,
he sighed, before turning back to Harry.
What stage are you at? Stage 2,
Harry said, dodging as the potion bubbled and spat out a bit of purple liquid.
Decoding that's the one Peter spilled the fire whiskey all over, isn't it?
Padfoot asked.
Which is why you couldn't smell it out like you did with my pre-Christmas stash,
Mooney told him, grinning.
Damn it!
Padfoot exclaimed. Harry and Mooney both looked at him.
Prongs and I had a bet.
Padfoot explained.
I thought you had found somewhere outside the dorm to hide it, but he insisted it was inside but too well hidden to be found. Looks like I owe him a galleon.
Harry and Mooney exchanged a look, unsure of what to say.
Remind me to pay you later, kiddo.
Padfoot said.
Me?
Harry asked, dropping in another handful of berries. The potion turned a darker purple.
I can't exactly pay James, can I?
Padfoot asked.
But if I had, the money would have gone into his vault and that's gone to you so logically. Don't argue,
Mooney advised, as Harry opened his mouth.
Just take the money.
Padfoot laughed and tapped one of the seedlings in his pot with his wand. He checked something in Producing Plants, an advanced guide, shook his head and flicked his wand again and then glanced over to see what Harry was doing.
Remember, kiddo, just the 2 handfuls. I know,
Harry said, sheepishly. He had added 3 the time before and the potion had turned black and highly poisonous. They had dipped the locket in it, just to see whether it'd do anything, but it hadn't. They hadn't taken Kira up on her offer yet. If anything, the locket had come out looking shinier, which made Padfoot speculate about whether it was goblin-made. That hadn't made any sense to Harry, so he had just nodded.
I don't remember you lot using Nightshade,
Mooney said to Padfoot, as he used his wand like a watering can.
Yes, you do,
Padfoot said. Harry stared as the seedlings grew several inches and started to sprout buds and leaves.
The extra went into my potion kit and the next lesson we were making that stupid sickness cure and... Oh,
Mooney said, in a very different tone.
The elderberries. The what?
Harry asked.
Elderberries,
Padfoot said ruefully,
look a lot like Nightshade to 2nd years that haven't had any sleep the night before.
Harry grimaced.
I put in what I thought were elderberries and Prongs was feeling a bit off after our long night, so he had a few mouthfuls when Slughorn wasn't watching. Poisoned himself,
Mooney said, almost fondly.
Spent a night in St. Mungo's and then 3 days in the hospital wing under constant supervision. He almost died, we were all terrified at the time. I didn't go to lessons for 3 days because I was sitting with him,
Padfoot said.
I think I left once to add something to the potion because Peter couldn't be trusted to do it, but other than that... People thought you had been poisoned too,
Mooney chuckled, and then turned back to Harry.
Once we knew James was going to be all right, the whole thing became terribly funny. As far as the students were concerned, Lily had got sick of James and poisoned him, and the staff were just as confused. Poor Madame Pomfrey couldn't for the life of her work out how James had managed to eat nightshade berries, since they're not used at Hogwarts until 4th year, when you cover poisons and antidotes. And we weren't about to enlighten her about that,
Padfoot said, grimacing.
She wrote a very angry letter to the apothecary in Diagon Alley that the three of us, because obviously James was in no state to do anything about it, went to great lengths to intercept.
Harry laughed, well able to imagine it. Well, Moony and Padfoot certainly, as he stirred his potion again.
Stop,
Padfoot said, taking the stirring rod away from him. The potion was still a dark, inky purple, but its consistency was like that of water instead of syrup. Padfoot checked his watch.
Is it wrong?
Harry asked, moving back immediately. Moony shuffled back with him.
No, it's right,
Padfoot said.
Any more stirring could ruin it though. The nightshade makes it volatile. Oh,
Harry said, peering at the still potion. Padfoot cast a quick charm that cleaned the stirring rod and set it back down. Harry checked, embracing your inner beast for the next set of instructions. He had never made it this far before.
It says to let it sit for 40 minutes and then to add the boggart blood. Is that right? Is that what the book says?
Padfoot asked.
Yes,
Harry said, checking again to make sure.
Then yes, that's right,
Padfoot told him, smirking.
Just a note for next time, it's always a good idea to check your watch the moment you complete the step of the instructions. Why?
Harry asked.
Because,
Moony said,
it's not uncommon for the next step to tell you to leave it for a specific amount of time. And you get the best results when you're closer to that time than if you're a minute off. The Wolfsbane potion, for example, needs to sit for exactly 70 minutes, and if you're not within 10 seconds of that, the entire thing is rendered useless. It's why I've always struggled with it. This one's a bit more forgiving,
Padfoot told Harry. Obviously, he had seen Harry's panicky expression.
You've got a window of about 10 minutes instead of 10 seconds.
Harry relaxed slightly.
The closer you are, though, the better the potion will be.
Harry's head was starting to hurt and he felt a stab of dread for 7 years of potions under Snape's glare when he got to Hogwarts. He wondered if Moony had guessed what he was thinking because he said, "Potion's a very easy subject to get good at." Harry stared at him.
It is. It's all about precision. Some of it is skill-based, particularly understanding the interactions of ingredients, and some of it is technique-based, but the majority of it is precision, and being able to follow instructions. That doesn't sound so bad,
Harry admitted.
Tempus admonius,
he said, flicking his wand. He used Padfoot's watch to set the proper time and then nodded, pleased with his handiwork. He had set the alarm charm on his wrist, where it would be impossible to ignore.
What do you say to lunch while you're waiting?
Padfoot asked, giving his plants one last look. Harry nodded enthusiastically and bounded to his feet. Padfoot laughed.
Moony. I've eaten,
Moony said, holding up a hand.
More food for us then,
Padfoot said, grinning.
But come down anyway. Why?
Moony asked. He was already getting to his feet.
Why? For the pleasure of my company, of course.
Padfoot said. Harry checked his potion again before following them out of the room.
Olive. You like olives?
Millicent said. Draco was, yet again, stuck next to her at dinner. Thankfully, however, she was so determined to pull Pansy out of her subdued state that she hadn't said a word to him all night. Draco was perfectly fine with that, but he could tell Pansy was fed up with Millicent's attention.
Just leave her alone,
he said, doing what he had been told to do lately, speaking his mind. Millicent lifted an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Daphne, however, who was on Draco's other side, turned around immediately and asked,
"Why do you care?"
Draco couldn't explain it, though. He didn't know why he had said anything. Daphne mocked, and then laughed. Draco shifted, uncomfortable.
"You've been strange tonight, Draco. Are you feeling all right?"
"Not really," Draco said. He wasn't feeling sick or tired, though. Just confused about the way he had been acting lately. And confused, because that was the way he was being told to act, so clearly it wasn't wrong. It felt it, though, and he didn't know what to do.
"What's wrong?"
Daphne asked, cocking her head to the side.
"I don't want to talk about it,"
he said, because he didn't know what to say. Otherwise, he might have said something that, he was reasonably sure, would only make things worse. And then he'd be even more confused. He groaned and buried his face in his hands.
"Draco."
That was Pansy. And she must be worried if she was talking. Her mother hadn't been well enough to come tonight, and so Pansy had been very quiet and trying very hard to ignore them all.
"What's wrong?" "My head hurts,"
he mumbled.
"Mrs. Malfoy."
A chair scraped and the Draco felt cool hands on his hair.
"Draco."
That was Mother.
"Are you all right?"
He shook his head.
"Are you able to walk?"
He nodded and let Mother help him up. She led him out of the dining room and into the sitting room and then guided him to a couch.
"I don't know what's wrong with me,"
he said, before she could ask what the problem was. She pulled his hands away from his face and then felt his forehead.
"You're not warm." "I don't think I'm sick,"
he said, looking at her for the first time. She arched an eyebrow and flicked her wand. She frowned and then did it again. This time he felt a sensation like hands on his skin and recognized the spell as a diagnostic charm. He had never known Mother to cast one before, though. Usually Dobby did it. Mother wasn't very good at healing magic.
"I don't think you're sick either,"
she said, tucking her wand into a sleeve of her silky dress robes.
"Unless you did the charm wrong,"
he mumbled, saying what he thought again. Questioning Mother was a very brave thing to do and he wasn't entirely sure why he had done it. He wished he was sick, because then he'd have an excuse to go home and sleep.
"Unless I did the charm wrong,"
she agreed. Draco stared at her. Mother never admitted any weaknesses. He stared even more when she added,
"And that is a distinct possibility."
Then she smiled, as if she knew how thrown he was, and she probably did, and added,
"Wouldn't you agree, Draco?"
"Yes," he said, because that's what she seemed to want. Instead, she raised her eyebrows again.
"Is that what you really think?"
she asked.
"Or are you just saying what you think I'd like to hear?" "I don't know,"
he said.
"Do you think I'm good at medical magic?"
she asked. Draco didn't know what to say. It would be rude to tell her no, and she had always encouraged good manners, but she had also been encouraging him to tell the truth, even if others didn't want to hear it.
"I don't know,"
he said after several long seconds of deliberation.
"I've asked you to tell me the truth,"
she said sternly.
"No,"
he said.
"No, what?" "No, I don't think you're good at medical magic,"
he mumbled. She smiled and Draco didn't know how to feel. He felt like crying, except Malfoys didn't cry, but maybe he should because Father had told him just the other day not to hide his feelings. But if one of the other children saw him, then they'd hold it over him for years. And Draco'd always been told not to care what others thought about him, if they were thinking about him, either good things or bad things, that was good, because it meant he had made an impression. But lately Mother had told him that other people had feelings and thoughts too, and that he should listen to them, and that he should make sure people only had good things to say about him. He felt like screaming. Malfoys were allowed to do that, sometimes, but it wasn't proper. He was supposed to behave and not carry on or use the few swear words that some of the older purebloods had taught him. That could upset people, and he was supposed to watch out for other people's feelings now. But, he was also supposed to do what he wanted to do, without worrying about whether it upset people or not. But how would that ensure people thought good things about him?
Draco?
Mother asked.
My head hurts,
he said again, and then he fainted.
You took your time,
Bluefoot said, folding his arms. Silverear and Greentooth flanked him, standing the same way.
I had a lot to do,
Remus said, folding his own arms. Bluefoot stepped forward, hand suddenly lifted as if he was going to grab Remus' throat. Remus didn't move, but he glared as hard as he could. Bluefoot was only about a yard away when he thought better of it and backed off again.
I should think so,
Remus said. Greentooth bared her teeth and stepped forward to smell him.
You smell clean,
she said accusingly.
I had a shower,
he told her, gesturing to his still damp hair. He had used a lot of soap to eradicate Harry, Sirius, and Dora's scents. Dora's in particular would be incredibly dangerous to have on him. Remus was on delicate ground with Greyback, but that could become a lot worse if he found out Remus was friendly with the woman who had maimed him to save Matt in October.
Trying to hide something?
Silverear asked.
You'll never know,
Remus said. All three of them bristled.
Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to let Greyback know I've returned. I'll do it,
Greentooth said at once.
I'm capable, I assure you,
Remus said. He hadn't expected that to deter her, so it didn't particularly surprise him when she and the other two formed a triangle around him and escorted him into the building. Remus kept his head up, trying to look as unaffected by it as possible. Hardly anyone was looking anyway. Dinner had been served and most were fully focused on that. Those that weren't were listening to Greyback, who was, as usual, lounging in his throne.
Diagon Alley in London,
he was saying. Remus groaned, causing Bluefoot to snarl at him. This story was told almost nightly at the camp. Greyback had bitten a girl a while ago and had not been able to find her since. Remus was impressed. It wasn't easy to hide from Greyback. Unfortunately for Greyback's mystery girl, however, she had hidden herself so effectively that Greyback had become obsessed with her and with the idea of finding her.
I wasn't planning to gift anyone that night, but then she walked past, looking so small and afraid.
Remus snorted. Most people looked edgy if they were in Diagon Alley at night, especially if they were young and alone. And Greyback probably had been planning to bite if he had positioned himself in Diagon Alley during a full moon.
I knew I never wanted her to look that way again, and I knew I could help her,
Greyback said. Greentooth sighed happily from beside Remus. Remus snorted again and she turned around, looking furious. Remus looked away hurriedly and spotted Matt, sitting with some of the older women on the other side of the room. Matt gave him a thumbs up and Remus shrugged and nodded. Matt nodded once and patted the seat beside him and Remus shook his head. Matt tipped one shoulder and Remus tilted his head at Greyback. Matt nodded once more and gave the woman beside him, her name was Candace, a sheepish look. She had been distracted by their silent conversation. Remus looked back to Greyback, who had got to his feet and was pacing.
Fought. Already it was clear that my gift was making her powerful, one small bite and already she was brave, she was fighting.
Greyback turned to his audience. Remus didn't know what was more sickening, the story, Greyback's obvious pleasure, or the fact that almost everyone in the room was hanging off Greyback's every word.
She managed to get me off, quick with her wand, she was, and by the time I had oriented myself, she had vanished. Where is she now?
One boy, Remus thought his name was Rednose or something similar, called. Gone, Remus thought dully. Like smoke in the wind.
Gone,
Greyback said.
Like smoke in the wind.
The women Matt were with sighed and he looked distinctly frustrated when Remus glanced in his direction.
I'm searching though, for your lost sister. My lost daughter. I'll find her and bring her home, my children. Thank you, father,
Green Tooth murmured from beside Remus. She wasn't the only one who had said it, either. Greyback's obsession seemed to be contagious. Remus hoped for the mystery girl's sake that she was either very far away, or very well hidden. If she was found and brought to the camp, she'd be watched so closely by all of her adoring siblings that she'd never get away again.
Green Tooth,
Greyback said, spotting Green Tooth, Bluefoot, Silver Ear and Remus. Everyone else seemed to take that as a signal to start eating again. Remus approached before any of the other three had a chance to drag him forward.
Greyback,
Remus said, as the other three tipped their heads back. Greyback held each of them by the throat, much more gently than he had ever done with Remus or Matt, and then released them. They melted through the crowd and disappeared out through the door again.
Son,
Greyback said imperiously.
Welcome home. Back,
Remus said, folding his arms.
What? Welcome back.
Remus told him.
Not welcome home. I thought I told you that I wouldn't stand for any threatening. It's an indication that I don't want to be here,
Remus snorted.
I don't think I could be any less threatening.
Greyback's fist collided with his cheek. It wasn't entirely unexpected, but it still hurt and Greyback had hit hard enough to push Remus back a few steps. Remus winced and rubbed his face, but Greyback seemed to have wanted a more dramatic reaction. It suddenly occurred to Remus that Greyback was testing him as much as he was testing Greyback. That could be very dangerous, he thought, taking the punch as a dismissal. He crossed the room and took a seat next to Matt. Candace and the others left when they saw him coming, who wordlessly passed over his cup of water.
Thank you,
he said, pressing the cold glass against his face.
No problem,
Matt said, his eyes on two of the younger children over. They were only 4 and were quite wild.
So where were you?
Remus glanced over his shoulder and leaned closer.
Dora's been covering for us with Malfoy, but Malfoy was getting suspicious. She thought it might be good if he saw me today, just to show I haven't just run off, and that gives your story credibility too. She sends her greetings by the way. Theodora?
He asked. Remus nodded.
That's nice of her. She,
a large, hairy hand closed around Remus' shoulder and then meaty breath was in his face. Matt's shoulder was likewise held.
Just a warning, sons,
Greyback said.
You're looking awfully suspicious.
Remus had several sarcastic retorts he was dying to use, but he bit his tongue and tried to look as dignified as it was possible to look with a glass of cold water pressed up against his sore face. Matt, unfortunately, had other ideas.
Suspicious, father?
He asked.
I think you need your eyes tested. What were you talking about?
Greyback snarled.
A friend,
Matt snapped.
Another pet?
Greyback asked, glaring at Remus.
Not my. She's human,
Remus said tiredly, turning the glass. The side was beginning to get warm.
Would you mind going away? Sick of me, are you?
Greyback asked, squeezing Remus' shoulder painfully. Remus assumed, from Matt's wince, that he had done the same to Matt.
Yes,
Matt said. Greyback growled and Matt winced again.
That and it's awfully hard to look suspicious with you hovering over us,
Remus added, channeling Sirius. Thankfully, Greyback seemed to realize he was being mocked, and that he stood no chance of winning a battle of wits with either of them, and left with one more shoulder squeeze as a warning. Remus knew they'd pay for it later but couldn't bring himself to care.
2 months left,
Matt muttered, brushing the place Greyback had touched his jumper. Remus groaned and leaned back in his seat, glass still pressed against his cheek. End of chapter.